Hello, and welcome to today's event. A nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. Today's event is sponsored by Executive Intelligence Review magazine. We've assembled an international group of panelists whose work in the field of military affairs, intelligence, and statecraft is brought together so that we might figure out how, some 60 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis, we can walk the world back from the brink of thermonuclear destruction. Now, for those that say that we are not yet at such a point, we reply, that is exactly the hubris that will lead to miscalculation, that can lead to a civilization ending and perhaps species ending thermonuclear war. And that's exactly what makes today's event necessary. Now, we're also going to be conducting a question and answer session, and I understand that there are several persons from the press that are going to be joining us. And therefore, we're asking that our speakers, all of whom deserve a full program of their own virtually, please keep the remarks within the times that have been discussed. We want to actually get to the discussion as quickly as we can, and everyone will have a chance to avail themselves and say as much as possible at that time. That will also help to accommodate the busy schedules of everybody that is working together with the event. Now, today's assembly was actually the idea of two people in particular, both of whom, besides appearing on the infamous Ukrainian kill lists, are speaking here today. And I'd like to introduce one of them now. She'll be acting as my co-moderator today. She's become very well known in the United States and internationally in the past months and is presently a candidate for the office of United States Senate, seeking to represent the state of New York in the Congress. It's my pleasure to introduce Diane Sare, a musician, statesman, and a good troublemaker. Good morning, Diane.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you to all of the military and strategic experts who are joining us here today. A few weeks ago, I wrote a statement asking the question whether the suppression of my campaign in the United States was a prelude to nuclear war. And I asked that question because it seems that no one is willing to consider what it means to declare that Russia cannot win, where it should be obvious to anyone that Russia cannot afford to lose, especially when one considers the fate of Napoleon or Hitler. And I would like to add for the record, unlike many people today, I believe that it was good that Napoleon and Hitler were both defeated. Now, when this question came up in a debate from which I was excluded for the reason I suspect that I asked, the Republican nominee only criticized the long-term Democratic Party incumbent for not launching the sanctions on Russia earlier, as if that would have done anything to alleviate the current situation. What I wanted to just quickly remind everyone about, and why we're here today and why I think this is so very urgent, is a fairy tale with which most of you are probably familiar, by Hans Christian Andersen, called The Emperor's New Suit of Clothes. Now, most people talk about the little boy at the end of that fable who points out to everyone who's been going along with the lie that the emperor has no clothes, and he shatters the lie and suddenly everyone says it. But Hans Christian Andersen actually has a different point to that story, because if you remember what happens after the entire village recognizes that the emperor is naked, is that the emperor continues with the parade. And therefore, what has been exposed is not the vanity and corruption of the emperor, but the corruption of the entire population of the village. We have a situation now where, thanks to the indiscreet text message from former British Prime Minister Liz Truss to Secretary of State Tony Blinken, saying it is done, just moments after the Nord Stream pipelines were exploded, of a situation very much like the emperor being exposed, for being completely naked. And the question before us, in my opinion, is whether the populace is going to find themselves more enlightened than the crowd in Hans Christian Andersen's fable. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Diane. And I think you've got a guest that you're going to introduce at this point.
Yes, I do. And that is a new friend, Stephen Starr, who is a laboratory advisor, retired University of Missouri, and expert on nuclear war and nuclear weapons. And I think his presentation will be a very good reminder for people who may have forgotten why we cannot afford to go there.
Well, thanks for introducing me, Diane. It's a pleasure to be here. It's an honor. I'm honored to be with all your guests, and I fully support your candidacy. Would you like me to share my screen and start my presentation now?
Yes, please.
Okay.
They can.
Let's see. Well, I think I'd like to talk about what a nuclear war would mean. And I'll try to do that as quickly as I can. The US and Russia can each launch 800 to 1,000 strategic nuclear warheads in a period of about 5 to 15 minutes. And let's see here. These are not warheads like the Hiroshima bomb. It was 15 kilotons or 15,000 tons of TNT. These warheads are 7 to 50 times larger than that. For example, Russia, about half of the Russian launch-ready nuclear weapons have an explosive power of 800,000 tons of TNT or 800 kilotons. For example, one warhead like this detonated over New York City would create a nuclear firestorm on an average weather day that would encompass 150 square miles. And no one within that firestorm will survive. Really? Okay.
Yeah.
I'm not sure why. Okay. Okay, is this working for you now?
Yes.
Okay, I apologize for that. Those difficulties are always a problem. So this is a picture of a large thermonuclear weapon from a distance of 50 miles that would be similar to what you would see being detonated in a nuclear war with the US and Russia. And this is an image of the firestorm I mentioned. I put the picture over New York City to give people there an idea of how large one nuclear warhead would do. There would probably be a number of nuclear warheads that would be targeted in a place like New York. You know, the US and Russia have, you know, only a few hundred cities. The population is greater than 100,000 people. So, you know, they've got plenty of warheads to go around. These warheads would be delivered, primarily the launch-ready warheads would be coming from intercontinental ballistic missiles. Those are land-based missiles, and they have about a 30-minute flight time going from the US to Russia or from Russia to the US. But they can also include submarine-launched ballistic missiles. And if these subs are parked off the coast of Russia or the US, they can hit targets there in as little as 7 to 10 minutes. Now, a launch would be detected here by the North American Aerospace Defense Command. It's a picture of where it is buried in a mountain. They're always busy 24 hours a day getting ready for a nuclear war. If they detect it, then what will they do? Well, the US and Russia have maintained a policy of what they call launch on warning for quite some time. What this means is if a nuclear strike is detected on early warning systems, we'll launch a retaliatory strike before the strike arrives, while the enemy missiles are in the air and before any nuclear detonation occurs. So a false warning of attack, if it's believed to be true, would make the retaliatory strike a nuclear first strike. In other words, accidental nuclear war. There's been many false warnings of attack in the past, but you know, when you have low levels of tension, they're less likely to be believed. But you know, right now we don't have that. So missile flight times determine the time allowed to order a nuclear counterattack. The president must order a retaliatory missile strike that allows his missiles to launch, before the incoming nuclear warheads destroy them. So it takes at least a few minutes for early warning systems to issue an attack warning. The people at NORAD are tasked to provide a warning within 3 minutes. And a missile attack by subs off the coast will allow only a few minutes of time to contact the president. If you have 7-minute, 10-minute time from a launch to impact, doesn't give you very much time to evaluate it, have a threat conference, and figure out what to do. So you have 3 minutes to detect and confirm such an attack. Then you would have the president is contacted in the Situation Room if he's at the White House or somewhere else by a secure line overseas. And he has, with a sub attack, you'd have maybe 30 seconds to have a conference. You'd be told what's going on and what his options are to retaliate. And then it takes, let's say, assume he gives the order to launch right then. It takes 2 to 3 minutes to give and transmit the launch order. It takes about 2 minutes for the ICBM, the Intercontinental Ballistic Missiles launch to be launched and get out of harm's way. And it takes about 15 minutes for sub-missile launch. So, but just suppose a warning of attack was false. I mentioned if the presidents are not at the White House, they're always followed by a nuclear suitcase. And it takes about 1 minute for those to order a launch. It's an automated communication device that connects the president to the National Command Authority. Now, this is what it would look like in Russia if they detected an attack. This is their NORAD. So I wanted to mention that the Russian military can issue a launch order that bypasses all lower levels of command. They're ready to launch within 10 minutes. And not just the president, but also their defense minister and the current chief of the general staff has the nuclear briefcases there. They're all able to give the order. The Russian military can follow a US pattern of launch procedures, or they can order a remote launch. They can push a button and override all the lower subordinate chain of command and missile launch crews. They're threatened if they have a missile coming at Moscow and they have, they might even have less than 7 minutes. So they're streamlined to attack. Once these missiles are launched, it cannot be recalled. If there is an attack, a full-scale war, this is an image created by scientists that did peer-reviewed studies that show what would happen. Each click is 1 day. The smoke rises into the stratosphere from nuclear firestorms. An 800 kiloton warhead creates a 150 square mile firestorm. So, 500 of those would probably create 50,000 square miles of nuclear fires. The scientists estimate that 70% of the sunlight in the northern hemisphere would be blocked from reaching the surface of the earth, and about 35% in the southern hemisphere. The smoke is above cloud level, cannot be rained out, and it would remain in the stratosphere for about 10 years. The first 1 to 3 years, daily temperatures in Central North America and Eurasia would be below freezing. And after it would be at least 10 years before the weather would be warm enough to grow crops. So most humans and animals would starve to death. And I think that's probably all you need to see.
Okay, well, that was an efficient report, which will now be followed by our next speaker, Scott Ritter, United States Marine Corps, an intelligence officer, military analyst, the former chief weapons inspector to Iraq from 1991 to 98, charged with finding and destroying weapons of mass destruction. And he had some difficulties with some of the people that didn't want him talking, and he's been talking ever since. So Scott, we're happy to have you. Take it away.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and thanks for everybody for coming. We live in a day and age where I think the American public is, I'm not going to say immune, but ignorant of the reality of nuclear conflict. I grew up during the Cold War. My father was a career Air Force officer. At that time, there was a book, popular book called Alas, Babylon, and that was a code name. It was a story about nuclear conflict. And it was a term that a military officer would call his wife and say, nuclear war is upon us. And my parents adopted that same phrase because my father was involved in Air Force units that were responsible for the delivery of nuclear weapons. And You know, I don't think there's a husband or a father out there that doesn't love their family and doesn't hope that their family can survive the unthinkable. And so my parents adopted that code word. And I can tell you that almost every other Air Force family did the same thing. And what that means is that my mother and my sisters and I grew up with every day potentially being the last day of our lives. And this was real to us. We understood it. We understood what was happening. This isn't just duck and cover underneath a desk. This is understanding the real consequences. When I lived in Germany, we lived next door to a place called North Point. North Point was a nuclear weapons storage facility for the United States Army in Europe. It would be one of the first targets attacked by the Soviets if the balloon ever went up. And during the late 1970s and early 1980s, the balloon was threatening to go up on a daily basis. And so we literally got into the school bus every morning wondering if the world would end that day. And when my father disappeared into the bunker, the nuclear bunker, by the way, and was incommunicado for several days, the fear factor was genuine and real. I joined the Marine Corps to serve my country. My first unit that I was assigned with was a nuclear capable artillery unit. And we oftentimes carried out exercises practicing the launch of nuclear weapons. And I will tell you that we did our job. I mean, it was basically get the job done, train, so that it's muscle memory. So that if time comes and you have to do it, there's no thinking, you just do it. So the hope that a military professional is somehow going to grow a moral conscience and say, I refuse this order, don't hope that. Military professionals carry out the mission that they're given. And this came to light, the consequences came to light during a division level field exercise where we were training to stop a Soviet invasion through Iran, where they were going to try and capture the warm water ports. And we simulated going into Iran to intercept them and stop them. And of course, we had insufficient forces. The Soviets broke through our lines and are moving forward. And the order was given for the artillery to fire the nuclear round. And we fired it. And there's a lot of procedures involved in that, and I won't get into it. But the bottom line is the simulated round went downrange, and we hit the Soviet units. We destroyed them, and then the follow-on echelons, which are trained to operate in a nuclear environment, passed through the area. And then the war ended. And I said, wait a minute, we didn't get a chance to fight these next guys. They said, no, it's over. So why? And they said, well, because they hit us with nuclear weapons and we're dead. It's indexed, done. That's the reality of nuclear war. You don't get to live and fight again. You die instantly. I went on from that job to be a weapons inspector at the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, implementing the first disarmament of nuclear weapons. At that time, and people don't remember a lot, I mean, I think almost everybody in this panel is old enough to remember, but the world almost came to an end several times in the 1980s because of intermediate nuclear range missiles. Soviets had SS-20 missiles, 3 warheads. We deployed Pershing II missiles and ground-launched cruise missiles in a response. The Pershing II at that time, if fired from a position in West Germany, could strike Moscow within 7 to 12 minutes. And this is what Stephen Starr was talking about. The absolute inability to make reasoned thinking during that time period. And we trained them all the time. There was a scary incident in the 80s where the Norwegians launched a atmospheres test rocket, and the Soviets mistook it for a first strike. Fortunately, the Soviets had somebody who hit the pause button, and they didn't go into the launch on warning, or else none of us would be here. But the 1980s was all about dodging nuclear Armageddon. And one of the greatest things that has ever happened, it's one of the most underappreciated moments in American history, is when Ronald Reagan signed the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty with Mikhail Gorbachev, because we literally saved the world from suicide, from nuclear death. If it weren't for the INF Treaty, I firmly believe that there would have been an accident that spun out of control and led to a general nuclear exchange. We got rid of those missiles, and we set the stage for a larger disarmament, strategic disarmament reduction. But we have forgotten about that since then, because the Soviet Union went away, Russia has emerged, we don't respect the Russians as much, but now we belittle them. We've forgotten what the reality of nuclear conflict is, to the point where we reactivated the 53rd Artillery Brigade, which was a Pershing II brigade during the Cold War. They've reactivated in Germany, and we're getting ready to deploy a new family of intermediate range missiles, the so-called Dark Eagle hypersonic, which gives us rapid first strike capability against Moscow, which will trigger. Now people say, well, wait a minute, can't we win a nuclear war? Let me give you a quick war story, and I'll end with this. I was an inspector outside of a Soviet missile factory, Votkinsk. They produced the SS-20s. We were ensuring they didn't produce anymore. They also produced something called the SS-25. And we had a little incident in March of 1990 where we had this giant X-ray machine that we wanted to, by treaty, we're supposed to X-ray the SS-25 canisters to make sure they weren't hiding SS-20 missiles inside. And the Soviets refused to allow it to go operational for reasons I won't go in here. It wasn't their fault. But in the process, during the crisis, they sent 3 missiles out of their plant. And we were like, why would they do this? Why would they risk the ire of the United States, risk the treaty, just 3 missiles out of the plant? Well, it turned out that those missiles were SS-25 missiles. They weren't prohibited by the treaty, but they weren't missiles designed to deliver nuclear warheads. They were missiles designed to carry a communications package. They were called, the SS-25 was no longer the Topol, it was the Syrena. And the Syrena is part of a system called the Dead Hand or Perimeter. And these missiles were part of 9, a contingent of 9, 6 had already been sent out, that were a special regiment that in times of conflict automatically go to the field. They're always in the field. And if we succeeded in carrying out a first strike against Russia that decapitated their leadership, the people in Washington, D.C. might think, the war gamers might think, aha, advantage America, Russia won't do anything. Russia will do everything because the dead hand takes over. Destroy Russian or Soviet command and control, communication signals are sent to the dead hand control room, stop functioning. And when they stop functioning, the dead hand kicks in. And the dead hand launches these Syrena missiles with their communication package, and they fly across the length of Russia, broadcasting launch codes, which automatically send the entirety of the Soviet nuclear force to their targets. The world ends. Ladies and gentlemen, you cannot win a nuclear war. It's impossible. And yet we continue to build weapons that makes us think that we can manage the escalation of a nuclear conflict. It cannot be done. We use 1 nuclear weapons against the Russians. They launch everything automatically. There is no escalation control. There is no escalate to de-escalate. There's only instant Armageddon, the death of all humanity. And that's the message I want to impart. Nuclear wars cannot be won. They should never be fought. And therefore, nuclear weapons should never exist.
Thank you very much, Scott. Well, back to you, Diane.
Thanks. So I would like to introduce one of our international guests, retired Colonel Alain Courbez, who was the former advisor to the General in Command of UNIFIL in Lebanon and the former international relations advisor to the French Foreign Ministry. Colonel Courbez, and yes, good, you're unmuted, excellent. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your invitation. This panel is very interesting because it's relatively rare that people talk about subjects they know. On this panel, you have people talking about something they know very well, but you can hear so many so-called specialists or and even some head of states who don't know anything about nuclear warfare. And as my predecessors say on this panel, nuclear warfare, it's impossible. It's completely impossible. I want to remind everybody that when General de Gaulle wanted to build the I forget the name in English for the dissuasion force in France to be independent and to be able to decide by itself if they need to wage a war or not. And to be independent, he knew perfectly that we needed nuclear warfare to impeach, to dissuade the possible opponents to fight against France. He said one day, this is a small phrase which is very important. He answered to a question by his minister, Alain Perfit, who asked him about the force de frappe. Are you afraid, Mr. President or General, are you afraid that we could kill 15 million people in 1 second somewhere in the world? He said, yes, of course, this is frightening, but you must understand that the French force de frappe, the French nuclear power is not has not been created to strike other people, but to impeach, to dissuade any other people to strike on France. Then it's not made for striking others, but it's made to impeach, to dissuade the others possible enemies of France to strike. This is a fundamental principle of even on a philosophical point of view. It's very important because when de Gaulle made the French bomb, many scientists of very high level, he was attacked by so many people who said stupid matter they don't know very well, are able to say stupid things. And on this matter of nuclear warfare, most of the people who talk about that don't know really, as Scott Ritter very well and clearly explained recently, and as Mr. Sare, I think, before him, presented what is a nuclear warfare. It is evident that it is not possible to wage a nuclear warfare. And that's why I was very honored and pleased to be invited in this panel because it's your language, is your speech to American citizens. I am not in a position to say anything to the American citizen about the next very close elections. But your language is a language of humanity. That is fundamental because the nuclear has made a major change in the art of war since the beginning of humanity. It's not a continuation with more powerful means, more powerful armament of what's happened since the beginning of humanity. It's completely different. Now, the big strategist in France, de Gaulle, of course, but also change completely our mind when we think about nuclear, because all these great spirits, these great thinkers, were continuing to have the same processing of thinking about war instead of changing completely, because from the beginning of humanity, it was the coercion principle which was ruling the war. And the coercion is, I have an army which is superior to yours, then I impose my will to you. But now with the nuclear war, it's different, and that is why the French nuclear warfare is not made to strike others, but to dissuade others to strike us. Now it's not coercion, but it is dissuasion, which is completely different. It says you cannot strike me because if you dare to do that, I strike you of the power than you will have dégâts, you will have destructions in your country which are not acceptable. Then the principle nuclear warfare is completely changing the beginning, the art of war since the beginning of humanity. I try to explain that in English with my French accent, but I would like to explain that more precisely in French, because it's a fundamental principle. You know, you cannot continue to think about nuclear warfare as we have made since the beginning of humanity, saying, as I am stronger than you, you have to obey to me. That's all. It's impossible now. Look at Kim Jong-un in North Korea. Now, even the stronger of the world, even Washington cannot force Kim Jong-un by a military mean, because if he has some missiles which could destroy part of America. And that's why now America cannot anymore force Kim Jong-un or North Korea
Excuse
to
me,
do
Colonel Correz.
something.
Okay. Thank you. It's all right. No, we appreciate both your enthusiasm and the fact you tried to speak to us directly in English. We got your message. It's a little bit of a problem with your signal, but when we get to questions and answers, please feel free to say whatever else you'd like to say. I'd like to introduce now Colonel Richard Black, former head of the U.S. Army's Criminal Law Division at the Pentagon, former Virginia State Senator, and a notorious interventionist. So, Colonel Black, good to see you.
Thank you very much, Dennis. Today, as we speak, mankind is in a foot race against globalist demons who are determined to trigger World War III while they still can. The White House is directing NATO in a hellish game of thermonuclear chicken gambling that President Putin will keep a cool, steady hand on Russia's nuclear trigger. So why is this desperate rush to war? Well, just 2 days ago, the Wall Street Journal ran an article headlined, "Republican Opposition to Helping Ukraine Grows." The Wall Street Journal finds, becoming a partisan issue. Now, here's the guts of the article. They say that 48% of Republicans now say that the U.S. is doing too much in Ukraine. The opposition to arming Ukraine has risen a stunning 700% just since the spring. But the resistance is stronger still, because today only 35% of Republicans and 45% of independents still support sending more aid to Ukraine. Most Republicans and most independents say no more aid for Ukraine. What is happening because of this is that Ukraine has become a Democrat war. Now, the midterm elections are looking bad for the war hawks. Wall Street Journal just reported a new poll that showed a very dramatic 27% shift toward Republicans among suburban white women who have formed in recent years a key part of the Democrat base. As of today, it appears that Republicans are almost certain to win the House, where the Democratic majority is already razor thin. If Republicans flip just 4 seats from Democrat to Republican, the Republicans will win control. Virginia alone, just one state, could conceivably flip 3 of those 4 states red. Republicans are also quite likely to win the Senate, which right now is tied 50-50, half and half Republicans and Democrats, with the vice president breaking ties. Already, we see Republican senators coming on the scene, like J.D. Vance in Ohio, someone who is virtually certain to win that election, and possibly Blake Masters of Arizona. And both of these are opponents of new war funding. This new wave will join the existing opponents of war funding in the Senate. NATO and Ukraine are acutely aware of Republican anti-war momentum going into the elections, and they are not sitting idle, and they are taking action. So this realization that there will be this electoral shift has accelerated the drive towards World War III, which is well underway. Now, in April and May, the US shared signals intelligence that helped Ukraine assassinate 13 Russian generals, and which sank flagship of the Russian fleet, the cruiser Moskva. NATO anti-ship missiles sent 300 young Russian sailors to the bottom of the Black Sea in that attack. On May the 19th, there was a headline in Business Insider that read, quote, "Biden is furious about the leaks saying US intelligence helped Ukraine kill Russian generals and sink its warship." When the US coordination was disclosed, President Biden was furious, not because it happened, but because it was revealed, because it was made clear to the American public what had happened. The sanctions imposed by the US and the European Union, of course, have cut most of Europe's vital natural gas imports from Russia by now. With winter approaching this year, protests have been breaking out across Europe, people demanding fuel for heat. And the people are demanding that the gas pipelines from Russia into Germany and from there to the rest of Europe be reopened. In order to defang these growing protests, NATO has sabotaged the Nord Stream 1 and 2 undersea pipelines, and they did this on September the 26th. They did it in order to ensure that any attempts to reopen them before winter would be futile. Now, the White House approved those attacks on Europe's pipelines. It's important to understand the United States is NATO, and NATO is the United States. We dominate it not only financially, but with the key officials who run the organization. As was mentioned earlier, there was, after the explosion of both of those undersea pipelines, there was a cell phone text from British Prime Minister Liz Truss to Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, and it was intercepted just 1 minute after these massive detonations. In the cryptic message, she simply said, "It's done." On October the 8th, British commandos planned a sophisticated Ukrainian attack, or series of attacks actually, on the Kerch Bridge connecting Crimea to mainland Russia. Now, Russian citizens, we need to understand, uniformly consider Crimea to be part of Russia. It has been historically for 500 years, and they consider it to be today, which it is under Russian law. NATO's attacks on the Crimea, NATO attacks to destroy the Kerch Bridge, are uniformly considered as attacks on Russia itself. Moving forward, CNN now reports that as recently as November the 2nd, saboteurs have infiltrated deep inside Russia itself, and they launched an attack destroying Russian attack helicopters with time bombs. Now, this attack was 600 miles inside Russia from the Ukrainian border. However, it was just 21 miles inside the Russian border from Latvia. Another very aggressive NATO member state. These attacks inside NATO are designed to make it possible for Russia to trip up and to miscalculate, perhaps triggering a full-out nuclear response by NATO, one that could trigger the ultimate conflagration. The United States, by the way, and I know this from personal experience, often does this type of thing where they will launch some sort of a mission that is designed to cause the other side to overreact or to react in a way that is negative, and to provide the pretext then for a counterattack. So this is a very, very dangerous thing, attacking inside of Russia itself. In late October and November, 2 ultra-secretive US ballistic missile submarines surfaced in a dazzling display of nuclear brinksmanship. A clear warning to Russia that if their nuclear missiles, or that if Russia responded to the nuclear, I apologize, if they responded to the Ukrainian attacks that were being launched against them, and they somehow crossed some invisible line, that nuclear missiles from NATO would rain down on Moscow and St. Petersburg in a Pearl Harbor style nuclear surprise attack on Russian cities. This is clearly the only purpose of deliberately surfacing those 2 ballistic missile firing submarines. We've reached a point where it is absolutely vital that the White House plans and the British plans must be exposed. The decline in support for the Ukrainian war has been driven by the fact that voters are learning that a violent coup was instigated by the CIA and British MI6 back in 2014. And it was that coup that overthrew Ukraine's duly elected government, leading directly to the present war in Ukraine. As the roots of war trace back to Obama's White House and to number 10 Downing Street, support for the war, it has been collapsing. Support for the war is likely to wither even more once voters are told how British Prime Minister Boris Johnson flew unexpectedly to Kiev in order to halt peace talks that had nearly ended the fighting between Russia and Ukraine just 2 months after fighting started and before most of the casualties had ever occurred. Since the time that Boris Johnson broke up those peace talks, clearly with the approval of the White House, British and American insistence on continuing the war has resulted in the death of easily 100,000 good soldiers on both sides. It's crippled twice that number, and it has devastated the region. Joe Biden could end this war at any time. He chooses not to. He chooses war. Our government is no longer responding to its people. Instead, it obeys the dictates of globalists, the boys from Davos, and a whole matrix of other globalist outfits, the kings, the princes, captains of industry, the billionaire celebrities, and dynasty families. Those whose true allegiance is to no land and no people but themselves. Men and women who grow fabulously rich on the blood of the men they kill. In closing, I'd just like to thank the Schiller Institute, which has become the preeminent voice for world peace. And I'd like to thank the heroic young men and women, the gutsy kids in their early 20s, whose raw courage is confronting some of these politicians and exposing them for what they're doing. Thank you very much for having me here today.
Thank you very much, Colonel Black. And let me just say to everybody that I know that Colonel Black and so a couple of others have some scheduling matters. So I'd like everybody to try to keep within the time limits so that we can get to the conversation and have some exchange. Back to you, Diane.
Well, now another guest from France, a longtime associate of Lyndon LaRouche, 3 times, I hope that's right, presidential candidate and leader of the French party Solidarité et Progrès, my friend Jacques Cheminade. Please unmute.
Thank you, Diane. Thank you, Dennis, for this invitation. Here from France, our message is that your voice, Diane, should be heard in the US Senate. I am Jacques Cheminade, president of our party, Solidarité et Progrès in France, but I am not speaking only on behalf of myself. I'm echoing the voice of most of the people in the field that I met this week campaigning for peace. They don't yet know Diane. They don't know yet who you are. But when I describe who she is, they deeply understand that she is a key factor to change the United States from a policeman of the world using military force on behalf of the financial oligarchy to, again, becoming a beacon of hope, a true American beacon of hope. Here, it is now quite widely spread that Russia has been provoked and trapped to militarily intervene in Ukraine, and that we are on the brink of an insane nuclear war. Now, the declarations from the main advisors to President Zelensky are more and more widely known. Those having said since 2019 that Russia has to be provoked and trapped into a war with Ukraine according to the plans of the RAND Corporation. Diane is therefore the only candidate calling for peace, security, stability, and cooperation as a whole in the present world. That's why I advise all the voters who believe and understand that peace is our common aim and the common aim of humanity. I advise them to vote for her, including those that have the candidates being prevented to run because of the rules-based order in the state of New York. Discrepancies, disagreements, and even boundaries should be thrown to the river on behalf of a common commitment for peace, making of our world the best of all possible worlds. No exclusion, peace based on shared development. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacques. Next, we're going to hear from Dr. Clifford Karakoff, former senior staff member of the U.S. Senate Committee on Foreign Relations and president of the Washington Institute for Peace and Development.
Thank you, Dennis. As long as this Ukraine war is going on, we are living under a heightened threat of nuclear war. And the only way this war can be terminated is by a diplomatic process between Russia and Ukraine, between Russia and Europe, between Russia and the US, NATO. There will be a diplomatic process at some point. but it's better to have it sooner, much sooner, rather than later. Russia characteristically has an old school approach to diplomacy. They, in this recent days, summoned the British ambassador and expressed their profound concerns to her about the attacks on Russian infrastructure, bridges and pipelines. They also, as another diplomatic step, informed the United Nations Security Council in a closed session about the details, they allege, involving British direct action and involvement with these, what are acts of war, although the Russians have called them acts of terrorism, maybe prudently, but they are acts of war, of course. The Russian ambassador remains in London, so relations have not been broken. The Russian ambassador at London so far has not been recalled for consultations in Moscow. That could happen. The public revelations that the Russian Foreign Ministry has stated that it will reveal about the British involvement, direct, remains to be seen. And the effect on global public opinion and the effect on foreign policies of various countries also will remain to be seen, depending on what revelations the Russians make public. Meanwhile, Ukraine is de facto a partitioned state, with much of the south and the east now within Russian borders. We can expect further Russian advances westward, as we learned from our military experts, such as Scott Ritter and Colonel Black. Whether Poland will grab Western Ukraine and Galicia is an open question. At present, Ukraine refuses diplomacy and peace negotiations. Thus, war termination is delayed. You can't have war termination without a diplomatic process, and Ukraine refuses to engage in a diplomatic process with Russia, according to its own president and parliament. So there is no present diplomatic process. We must advocate starting one up as soon as possible. The diplomatic process was torpedoed, as Colonel Black pointed out, by Boris Johnson in his April visit to Ukraine. Now let's recall the context here. France and Germany failed to advance the Minsk II process, and the Minsk II process was endorsed by the United Nations Security Council, Resolution 2202 of 2015, excuse me. Ukraine as a state emerged out of World War I, and Ukraine as a state will emerge from this conflict, no doubt, in a much altered condition. Ukraine was created a state in 1918 as a result of the Brest-Litovsk Treaty between Germany, Imperial Germany, and the Bolshevik regime, which it put into power in Russia by aiding Lenin during the war. In turn, Lenin gave to Ukraine Russian territory, which was the eastern and southern area, traditionally called Novorossiya, and we refer to it broadly as Donbass these days. Much of that area, but not all, has returned to Russia. Now, as we go forward, does Europe want further escalation that will lead to a general European war? Or even to a nuclear war? Will Russia launch a winter offensive to recover Odessa and the remaining parts of historic Novorossiya? It could, and we will see. But in my view, clearly, we must have, and we must insist on, as peace advocates, a diplomatic process to begin as soon as possible to prevent a general European war and to terminate the present war as soon as possible. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Cliff. And I just want to say for people who've just joined us, we're in the presentation part of our "A Nuclear War Cannot Be Won and Must Not Be Fought." And we have just a few more speakers. We want to keep it moving at this pace because we have various people who are online already to ask questions, and the discussion. This is kind of why we brought people together. So Diane, I'm going back to you. You introduce the next guest.
Great. I am happy to have such a French delegation. I think we have to have a fight to restore the principle of republics on this planet as opposed to empire. So I'm going to introduce General Dominique Delarade, who is formerly the military attaché of the French embassy to Washington, D.C., who was the commander of the 7th Alpine Infantry in Croatia, and many other things. And I'm really glad you could join us, and thank you for being here.
Yes. Thank you, Diana, for inviting me. First of all, I would like to say that I was not defense attaché on the French embassy in Washington, but I was a liaison officer to the school, War College in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. So that being said, I would like to come back on all intervention that have been made. On the first one, I would like to thank him to remind to all people what is really a nuclear war. For Scott Ritter, I would like to tell him that all what he says and all what he writes is very well known by the French people now. Personally, I promote all what you write because I agree with all you write and all you say. So that's I endorse your parole, your speech, your text, 100%. For Senator Black also, all what you say, all what you write is very well known in France. We follow that. We, when I say we, it's myself, of course, but also of my fellow comrades, generals, former retired generals or officers of the French army. Almost all people from my generation, from our generation, agree with what you say and what you are describing about the situation. For Alain Corvez and Jacques Cheminade, of course, I know them more than others because we talk together on a regular basis. And for Diane Sare, I would like to say that I am not an American citizen. I am just a simple and humble French citizen, citizen of the world. And I would like to say that, of course, I cannot endorse a candidate for US elections because it's not my role and my place to say that. In fact, it could be almost my place because I have a large part of my family, sisters and nephew and grandnephew who are American citizens, about 40 of them. My sister, which is an American citizen, has 24 grandkids and I don't know how many grandkids. So I have a lot of American in my own family. But what I would like to say about Diane Sare is that she is among the very rare candidates to understand the situation and on the international sphere. She understands very well what is going on in Ukraine. And when she says that Russia cannot afford to lose this war, she says that she is right. And the danger is here. If the US leadership, the current US leadership doesn't understand that, we have the risk of an accident, of a miscalculation, and that could lead us to a war that nobody wants. Nobody on the earth wants this war. I don't think this war will come from Russia. They have said numerous times that they don't want to fight a war that nobody can win. But I am afraid of the globalists leading the US foreign policy now. And certain of these guys doesn't understand really the situation. And certain of these guys could make a very great mistake. So I think voices should be heard in US Senate to make this US politicians understand better the situation. It's that I have to recognize that Diane Sare says today the truth to people, to her fellow New York state citizen. And she deserves to be a senator just to bring this voice, this powerful voice to say stop. And we solved this kind of crisis in 1960, 62. We were able at that time to make a compromise. Why not now? We have to respect the other camp, the security of Russia. We have to respect the people of Donbass, let them practice their language and let them go wherever they're heard. We'll bring them. That all what I have to add to all what was already said by Scott Ritter, Senator Black, and also Mr. Kirakov, and of course, Diane Sare, Jacques Cheminade, Colonel Corvez. Thank you
very much, General Dominique
Thank you.
Delaware. I just wanted to say something, by the way, about this issue of the French and why we have all these French guys. Well, the French have always shown up whenever there's a serious American that they can find. It's not often. That's why you often see this. Ben Franklin was the first, and with Lafayette's discussions with Washington and with others of America about the issue of slavery, you had some serious changes in America that never get admitted. And so when you're talking about getting serious about the actual Declaration of Independence and the real American Constitution, you can count on the French if you can count on yourself. I'd like to now introduce Ray McGovern, former senior analyst, U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, and a man who is well known as a creative, nonviolent, and also musical interventionist. Ray.
Thank you, Dennis, but I don't think I'll sing for my supper today. I just want to express my thanks for being invited together with this rather substantive group for a substantive discussion. My hat's off to Schiller Institute for arranging these seminars. I have to say that in 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis, exactly 60 years ago, as was just alluded to, we came very close to nuclear exchange. I knew that personally because I was a second lieutenant in the US Army Infantry Intelligence, and I was really near Key West. Had I been closer, I would have been with the invasion force that thankfully was never sent in. Let me jump forward to several years later, precisely 1983. As has already been mentioned, the 80s was a very, very delicate and very dangerous time. I was on active duty with the CIA at the time. Actually, I was briefing the Vice President, Secretary of State, and Secretary of Defense on any given morning. Ronald Reagan thought it a good idea to call Russia, the Soviet Union at the time, the evil empire. And he was authorizing all manner of covert action and all other kinds of things going on. On Labor Day weekend, KAL 007, a Korean airline, was shot down with all its passengers killed. It was shot down well inside Russia. And Secretary Shultz, who normally was a little bit more circumspect, took after the Russians and authorized a videotape that deleted the important segment. What do I say? I'm saying here that did the Russians intentionally shoot down a passenger aircraft? Yes, they did. Second question, did they know it was a passenger aircraft? No, they didn't. We had the intercepts. As a matter of fact, I'm not going to tell you what I told Schultz, but he acquiesced in his film people cutting out that part of the intercept that was played at the UN. And that guru in charge of that unit later said, you know, all countries lie. You have to lie when it was convenient to lie. Okay, so you have evil empire, you have KAL shoot down deliberately distorted to blacken the Russians. That was on Labor Day. In November, we had an exercise called Able Archer, a nuclear exercise which simulated the real thing so closely that the Russians thought it was the real thing. We could tell that from our national technical means, okay? It came really, really close. The vice president was going to be involved in this simulated exercise. What the Russians didn't know was simulated. They had to assume the worst. Luckily, we had a spy, courtesy of the British. Gordievsky was his name, and he told us, look, Andropov and these other guys are taking this for real. For God's sake, tone it down. What do? Well, there was one guy, a colleague of mine named Mel Goodman, who had the guts to go to Robert Casey, who is the head of analysis in CIA, and say, look, Bob, they're taking this seriously. Tell the White House to tone it down. Get the vice president out of this thing. Tone that exercise down. Now, Bobby Gates famously said later, it's not part of my job jar to make the Russians happy. And besides, they would never retaliate for us. They would never consider that. No, I'm not going to tell the White House anything. To his credit, Mel Goodman went to Bill Casey, Bobby Gates' supervisor, and Casey was persuaded. He called the White House and they toned it down. What's the lesson here? where we're all able to have this discussion, because in that set of circumstance, where it really looked like the Russians had to do the dead hand or worse, it was toned down. So what does this all mean? I think that we have to really get up and do something about this. We can't sit on our derrieres, to borrow some French, and vive la France for the French participants here. We have to kind of do more than spread some truth around, although for those of us who have some access to independent media, we have to do that. Now, when I say access to independent media, wonder of wonders, after a 6 or 7 year hiatus, I was invited onto Democracy Now! Just this week, and I debated with Matt Duss, who is described as a foreign policy advisor to whom? To the guy who lost the nomination to Hillary Clinton because she kind of manipulated the results. So what happens? Duss is arguing all kinds of things that aren't resembling reality, and I'm saying, my God, is this the kind of advice that people in the Democratic Party are being given? And so I thought, well, you know, we need to get this thing out, and you can see what the debate talked about. But the interesting thing is that nobody has been given the real scoop here. Those of us who are participating here know the real story. It's an amazing amount of relevant detail that has already been adduced here by previous speakers. We have to get off our rear ends and do something. Now, some of you know I favor the Noah principle. Noah as in the Bible, okay? Now, the Noah principle is this. No more awards for predicting rain. Awards only for building arcs. So each of us has to kind of pick out the plank that is closest to us, the place where we are most reliably judged, and get that plank and start nailing it into the bottom, the hull of this arc. And that means getting off our derrieres once again and doing what we need to do. Now, the problem here is that we cannot expect immediate success, okay? This is not about success. It's about being faithful. It's about telling the truth. One small vignette to finish here. One of my mentors, a fellow named Daniel Berrigan, after they did this terrific burning of draft cards in front of this little town outside Baltimore, sitting in the only federal facility there, the post office, okay? And he's thinking, my God, you know, was this worth doing? I mean, people are going to call me a commie. People are going to, they couldn't call him in Putin's pocket yet, but the equivalent. People will deride me. Was this worth doing? And then it came to me, and this is the core here. The good is worth doing because it's good. Results are not unimportant, but they are secondary. They are secondary to the goodness of the act. So what's the principle here? You go out and you do good. You don't expect immediate success. Why were those Chinese students on Tiananmen Square singing, "We shall overcome"? Why were the photos of Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. prominently displayed in the Palestinian small section of the Knesset in Tel Aviv? Immediate success, well, it'd be great to have, but it's not necessary. We need to create an example for those, if we're lucky enough, who come after us. So each of us needs to kind of figure out what we need to do. A derriere sitting, no longer permitted. Predicting rain, no longer predicted. We got to stick our necks out. And for those of us who have a little gray in our hair, okay, there is an advantage. And I'll tell you what it is. I've learned this. I've learned this from personal experience. And that is, most people kind of dismiss young people when they get arrested or when they get beat up. They got to come and tell them, look what they were doing. But old people, not so much. Old people have a big, big advantage. Why? Well, because most people, even Americans, they don't like old people getting beat up. So those of you who have a little gray in your hair, it's really nice for us to talk, but it's really required in these circumstances to do more than just talk. You have a big advantage. A big advantage comes with age. It comes with sympathy for old people. Some people even listen to old people. So put it in play before it's too late. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ray. I wasn't expecting that conclusion. I like that. The final speaker that we're going to be hearing today, and I said at the beginning that there were two people that had proposed today's gathering. You've heard from the first of those earlier, and now we have the second person. I think people know something about her. This is Helga Sepp-LaRouche, the founder and head of the International Schiller Institute. Helga?
Well, I want to thank all of the speakers who have spoken so far, because the biggest problem we have is that while I'm convinced that this is the most dangerous moment in history ever, simply because, you know, we never were as close as the extinction of the entire human species, the normal people have no inkling. I'm saying this, you know, because I remember very well, several people alluded to it, at the beginning of the 80s, when we had the medium-range missile crisis and the SS-20 and the Pershing II, where all the time on launch on warning, a few minutes away from World War III, people knew about it. And there were hundreds of thousands of people in the streets of Europe. And now the so-called peace movement hardly exists. I mean, it started now that people started to take to the streets, but compared to where we are, it is absolutely inadequate. So I full-heartedly want to thank the people who all contributed to this event. And I only want to mention one other thing is when the war danger existed and it became clear at the end of the 70s already into the early 80s, my late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, designed a security architecture, which was called the strategic, or was later called the Strategic Defense Initiative, which was implemented or put officially on the agenda by President Reagan on the 23rd of March, 1983. The Soviet Union at that time rejected it. But I think, you know, we need such an approach today. We need a new international security architecture, because if we do not get off this geopolitical confrontation, it is a question of time, especially with the going on collapse of the financial system, that the war danger will come to the point of no return. So we have conducted with the Schiller Institute since April of this year a whole bunch of conferences where we promoted the idea of having such a new international security architecture, which would take into account the interests of every single country on the planet, and that must emphatically include Russia, China, and all the other states which, you know, are on the list of being rogue states and so forth. So I would really like that, you know, immediately we have to get an awareness of the danger, but then we have to go to the next step and think, how can we change the world situation in such a way that we for sure indefinitely and sustainably eliminate this danger of civilization. So since we have done that, many of us have ended up on the list of the Ukrainian government, of the Center to Counter Disinformation, so-called, and another killer list, the Mirot-Vorets list. This is financed by the US government and by NATO, and that should be part of the thing which absolutely must become discussed internationally. So I also want to say, you know, while I'm not an American citizen, I full-heartedly want Diane to succeed. because she represents the kind of American which can bring back the pride to be an American and not what is the present condition where the anti-Americanism is increasing worldwide. And, you know, that cannot remain like that, because we have to include the United States in the new arrangement. And it is not enough if the countries of the global south and Russia and China are creating a new system. We have to move to a situation where every country is part of the world we are creating. And that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you very much, Helga. And now what we're going to do is we're going to go to questions. Now, I understand I'm supposed to tell people to raise their hands, and Diane will help me with this so that we don't miss anything. This often is a bit of a problem when you do these transitions. Let me also just check one thing, because I was told earlier that Colonel Black, you might have to get going. Is that the case? And if so, I'll let you say a few things here.
Yeah, I'll have just a few minutes, and then I will just disappear from the screen. But anyway, I really am grateful to everyone for coming together. I appreciate what Helga is doing by orchestrating this, because you have a major organization that you know, in the past there were organizations like Code Pink that advocated for peace, and I think they still do, but there's no resonance to their message anymore. So it appears that the lone remaining voice for peace as an institution is the Schiller Institute, and I very much appreciate what you're doing, because really all of our lives of my children, my grandchildren are at stake. And I don't think most people are even aware of it, but what you're doing is extremely important, and I appreciate what all the members of the Schiller Institute do.
Thank you very much, Colonel Black. Let me just, so Diane, do you happen to know how that this, you see anybody there? I have one person. Okay, then you go first, and then I've got a second thing. Go ahead.
Okay, there's several people with their hands up here, and if everyone is brief with your questions or comments, we'll get everybody in. But maybe we'll first go to Australia, to someone newly known to us, who I know is also working to change things there, Daryl Egan. And please say which press you represent or organization.
Hello, Diane.
Hi.
Hi. Look, my name is Daryl Egan. I'm a member of the United Nations Association of Australia over here. I'm on a bit of a night shift tonight. It's quite late here. My question would have to go to Scott Ritter. I followed a lot of Scott's work. And is Scott there at the moment? I think he's still there, you're correct?
Yes.
Oh, okay, Scott. Yeah, as a member of United Nations Association, of Australia, one of my lecturers was actually Tim Ford. You might know him. He was the UN head of UN mission from Australia from 1998 to 2000. Just going into a question with you in regards to our end of the world and AUKUS. Currently, the new Labor government has come into power here in Australia. Our pivot to Asia of such started more in 2007 when John Howard signed Australia up to the Security Quadrilateral group. And then after that, Kevin Rudd, briefly the next Prime Minister, took us out of it. His career didn't last very long after that. Julia Gillard challenged his leadership. And then when Julia Gillard got in, she got together with President Obama in the pivot to Asia and opened up a base in Darwin, another US base. That US base has just recently got some B-52 bombers that are capable of carrying nuclear weapons drop in there recently. From that, And at that time, when Julia Gillard was in power, I was in southern China for 4 years, experienced a lot there. And then I saw the deterioration of the relationship between Australia and China move more rapidly around 2015 from the trade under Kevin Rudd. We had the Quad Group then got back on board with Australia under Malcolm Turnbull. Going back to the Quad Group, we know who started that was Dick Cheney, the wonderful Dick Cheney. And we moved into the Quad Group. Now under Scott Morrison, who was a previous Prime Minister, we moved into AUKUS. He signed up a deal with nuclear weapons, nuclear powered submarines. First, he wanted to get a deal with France, but he left them in the lurch, and Emmanuel Macron wasn't very happy to our French guests. He called him a liar.
Would you ask your question,
Can you
please?
come to the, yeah.
Yeah, I'll get to the question. So in regards to this, and then Australia also signed a deal with the US to develop hypersonic weapons under the AUKUS deal. Scott or anybody there can answer me about the nearer we are to World War III with China and Australia being used as a proxy in a war with China with these developments with AUKUS. If anyone could come in on that, please.
Well, I mean, since the question was directed in my way, let's just be frank. I mean, let's just put the cards on the table. Australia is not a military powerhouse. So the idea of Australia serving as a proxy in a U.S. war against China is absurd in the extreme. Australia would be a tool, a minor tool. Australia provides some geographic advantages in terms of the basing of U.S. military equipment, but the Australian military is useless in a general war against China. Even your submarines would play a minor role, and that role would be terminated rather quickly because I don't believe they would survive a general war against China. And this is what Australia needs to understand. America, this isn't, World War II with the Japanese Empire knocking on your door, where you needed the United States to come in and be your close ally to defeat the Japanese back. The Chinese aren't knocking on your door with an invasion force. The Chinese are knocking on your door with economic opportunity that the United States is not able or willing to provide. Australia needs to look out for its own best interests, and its own best interests will be defined by a mutually beneficial relationship with that power or group of powers who seek to respect Australia's needs, wants, and desires insofar as they pursue the peaceful coexistence with the rest of the world. The United States is not offering that. The United States is offering you death, destruction, nuclear annihilation. You put American bombers on your soil becomes a target for Chinese nuclear weapons, and Australia will disappear that quick. So it's up to the Australians. You're allegedly a sovereign nation. Act like one. If not, lower the Australian flag, kick the Queen out, and admit your status as an American colony.
Yeah, totally agree with your comments. Thank you so much, Scott. I'm just very scared for our region in that way.
Yeah, let me just say this. I just want to first of all thank our friend from Australia, because I just checked the world clock, and am I correct? Is it 3:30 in the morning there? Is that
yeah. I've had a good dose of coffee, and I'll probably have a good sleeping on this Sunday morning.
Yeah. So we appreciate the question, your presence, and all of that. And I just wanted to say that because we were, and this is to everyone else who's on. We're going to list a few people, Diane. We should list a few people going to ask questions next, so they know that we have noticed them. We invite everybody to stay on. As many as our speakers are able to stay with us, we hope we can answer every question. There's a lot of questions coming in, written and otherwise. So if you want to direct your question, including by writing, let us know. Just make sure you put it in the chat or wherever you have to. So with that, Diane?
Well, I see Ray wiggling his fingers. I think that means he wants to say something. So he can do that. Maybe, Ray, I don't know if you saw Steve Starr's note in the chat, because you could deal with both of those at once, directing a question to you about whether you think that people running the White House, the neocons, believe that the US could actually, quote unquote, win a nuclear war. This idea was expressed in an article by, I can't read the rest of it, but
Lieber
Steve,
and
do you want-
Press in Foreign Affairs in 2006. They claimed the US had established nuclear primacy over Russia, meaning the US could wipe out all of Russia's nuclear retaliatory capacity with the US nuclear first strike against Russia. Do Blinken, Nuland et al. Subscribe to that?
And who's supposed to answer this?
Sorry, I couldn't unmute. Ray, go ahead and respond to both.
Yeah, I
And then,
just
yeah,
wanted to second what Scott said about the Australians. You know, before Iraq, there was only one Australian intelligence officer who spoke out and said, "This is a crock. This is stupid, and this is contrived. There are no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq." His name was Andrew Wilkie. He's a leader in the Australian Parliament now. He has no following. Why? Because the Australians are the obedient Germans of the East. And the sooner they wake up to the fact that they're being diddled, that they're being used, the better. That's what I have to say to my friends, and I have lots of them in Australia. Get off your derrieres. Okay, now, with respect to Blinken and not Blinken and Sullivan and those unwashed sophomores, I don't know what they think. The important thing is what Putin thinks about their rather cavalier attitude toward blaming him of raising the subject of tactical nuclear forces being used in Ukraine. What problem do I have with that? Well, just that he never said that. Get this, folks. Putin, Lavrov, the others in Russia, they never said that we might use tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine. There are lots of reasons for that. Main one is that it's not necessary. They are going to win anyway. So here's Putin looking at this and what's going on here? They're distorting what I said. There's a major New York Times and other major media campaign to think that I'm going to use tactical. What do they have in mind? Now, again, he has to turn to his generals. They have to assume the worst. That's what makes this situation so delicate, what the Germans would call labil. It is very delicate, and we have to get the word out. And when Putin's speeches are being distorted in so substantive a way, we need to call them on it. And unfortunately, there are only a few Andrew Wilkies here in the United States.
Okay, Diane, you have the.
sure. I couldn't tell if Scott was trying to say something. I see he posted something. I just like to point that out. Or, oh no, Derek. Anyway, there's the thing in the chat that people should see. So I'd like to go to CJ from, I think, Rogue News, and then after that, Suzanne Monk. But CJ, you there? Oh, try and unmute yourself again.
Okay, how's that?
Very
Yes.
good.
Excellent, very good. Well, I want to thank everyone for the participation. Schiller Institute, the Executive Intelligence Review, for a great panel. I have several very pertinent questions in regards to the conversation, but I think the first and foremost is in regards to revelations of the UK involvement with the sabotage of Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2, and then also revelations in regards to coming to us from the gray zone that there are documents that reveal that there are a cell of British military intelligence figures who are actually organizing to train covert Ukrainian partisan army with explicit instructions to attack Russian targets in Crimea. How soon does Russia, or where is the line of saying that Russia identifies that it's directly in military conflict with the UK? And that's my question.
I'll give a two-minute answer and then somebody could jump in. First of all, understand that the British have far more latitude than the United States does to carry out covert act. The we can sit here and lambaste the CIA all we want, and they deserve much of it. But the fact of the matter is, CIA is still limited to that can be done through a presidential finding, which means that you have to take it up to the president. The president has to issue permission, and this permission has to be briefed to Congress. And it would be a bridge too far to think that the CIA would come up and propose the conduct of what is in effect an act of war against Russia. But the British have no qualms about this. First of all, the British understand that they operate under the protection of the American nuclear umbrella. And their prime minister is able to make certain authorities that are independent of parliamentarian oversight. And so it doesn't come as a surprise that the British are in fact doing this. Understand that the Russians are a very mature nation with a lot of experience, and they know the game that's being played. Russia will not be sucked into a trap of overreacting, thereby politically liberating the United States and others to carry out actions that they currently are unable to for political reasons. Russia has said that they will respond symmetrically or asymmetrically at a time and place of their choosing, and they will do so. And this response may be in a manner which is it cannot be determined by the public at large. Russia is not in the business of winning the propaganda war. Russia is in the business of winning the war. The ultimate, declaration of victory will be the declaration of victory. When they win the war against Ukraine, and when they are able to compel Europe into accepting a new European security framework, it won't matter what England did. What Russia will not do, I believe, is carry out some sort of precipitous action designed to assuage public opinion or to put a bandage on, Russian honor. Russia wins by winning, and they're winning. And it doesn't matter what the British do; they're not going to stop this. I'm not saying this as somebody who's pro-Russian. I'm saying this as just a stone cold analyst who's taking a look at the facts. The British are pretty good at little commando raids here, there, and everywhere. But remember, the British did Dieppe, we did Normandy. That's all I'm going to say.
Thank you, Scott.
Great.
Okay. Oh, Suzanne Monk, you're here. Why don't you go ahead? And then I have a couple of questions for our international guests.
Yes, my question is pretty straightforward and simple. The beginning of this conflict, we knew that Russia invaded in part to stop and eliminate the threat of bioweapons laboratories that were funded and operated by the United States and NATO. My question is there any way we avoid World War III without the United States admitting those bioweapons treaty violations? In other words, do we get out of World War III without first having Nuremberg 2.0?
Anyone want to try and answer that question?
Real quick, then I'll just say this. There's not going to be a World War III because of the biolabs. The biolabs have been uncovered. They're being dismantled. The truth is out there. The United States, of course, isn't going to allow a tribunal to take place. It would be unrealistic. The only way a tribunal would take place is if the United States were defeated. And as an American citizen, I won't permit the United States to be defeated, and neither will 350 of my fellow citizens. There's not a power in the world that can defeat us. The only power that can defeat America is the American people, who, this is the key here, need to be educated about what their government has done. It's imperative that the truth be told to the American people about the ongoing violations of the Biological Toxins and Weapons Convention. And it's a duty and responsibility of everybody here. If we're concerned about nuclear weapons, we should be equally concerned about biological weapons. The truth is out there. We just need to find the vehicle to tell the truth. The only way to solve Americans' problems is through the peaceful revolution of the American people using the tools of democracy. As Ray McGovern said, we have to take the fight to the government. We take the fight. Any other nation wants to take a fight to America, they're going to run into people like me, who, while we may be angry at our country, love our country and will yield to nobody.
Yeah, let me just announce that we have a number of written questions also we have received, so we will go to those at the point that we can. We have a few people from the press, I think, who are still with us and are going to be asking questions. But Diane, you also said you had something for our international guests as well.
Yeah, I do, for either any of our French guests or also Helga, which is one, what is the view of European leaders, is it, or the people, I should say, which is more important, the people, in terms of that Russia is not going to lose this? And two, from France, is there a way that France could get out of NATO, or at least out of some of the agreements? Is there much sentiment toward that? Is that even a possibility? I guess,
Yes,
General, yeah.
I think France public opinion is now divided in two camps. The camps of people manipulated by the mainstream media, which all say the same thing about Russia. Russia is an enemy. Russia should be defeated. So that's the parole of the medias. Medias repeat that again and again and again. And certain people are just intoxicated by the medias. But you have a part of educated people in all sectors of the country. I would say military, member of parliament, justice, and university. A lot of people now understand that Russia has some reason to have done what they have done. So I think the more the time is going, and the more people, the people will switch gradually on the side of understanding what Russia did in Ukraine. That is to say, defending his sovereignty, defending the national security of Russia. So that's gradually enter in the head of common people. So I think the winter will be hot because all the consequences of the war in Ukraine will start to be painful for the French, and public opinion will switch with inflation, very high level of inflation. A lot of people will be unable to pay their bills at the end of the month, and that will create chaos in the country. You know, you will have demonstration, a lot of disorder in the country, and I think the politicians will be obliged to take that into account. And on the other side, I think that Putin knows that very well. He knows that in all Western countries, people are starting to make small revolution, and he knows very well that everything will increase and maybe will oblige Western government, the European government, to do something and to sit for negotiation. But at the time, when the European leader will take this decision, they will be in position of weakness. They will be weak because their public opinion will have switched. And I think the war in Ukraine is not only a military war, it's an economic war also. And the resilience of the population will prevail at the end of the party. And I think for that reason, I think because what you say at the beginning Russia cannot afford to lose, and Russian population has a resilience much higher than Westerner resilience. So I think that will shape the future, the next months of Western population, of Western states. I think we will go divided. We will divide between ourselves. Certain country will try to escape NATO. And in France, you have a movement of to exit from military integrated NATO, military wing. We don't want, a lot of people and a former military of my generation doesn't want NATO anymore, because we realize that NATO is drawing us in problems in their war, which are not our war. Is a war, US war, are not European war. And we have to dissociate as soon as possible from NATO.
Okay, let me just go over this with you, Diane, to see if we've got the same list here. So I think Nick Brana is next, then Karen Wilson. Then we have also a couple of written questions. One is from Yuka and one is from Mario. I have those, you may not have those. So
No, I don't. And also Bernie Holland should be added somewhere in there.
Okay, so then let's just do it in this order.
And Dennis, let me just tell everyone, I have to leave at 1 o'clock. It's 3 days before the election, so I can't stay here much longer, but just so people know if I disappear. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, and Jacques wants to comment. I see Bray's got his hand up, so let's do it in this way, okay? Zayed, you better say any summary word you want to say to everybody right now, because we're going to go in that order, I think.
Okay, well, I will hear from Nick shortly, which I appreciate, because, I mean, we do have to speak out, and the candidacy is a platform for having a voice, which has begun to have more and more of a resonance, but combined also with the action of some people who are here, Jose, who's hidden in the background, who confronted AOC and various other people, and most recently the man who said we learned to lie, cheat, and steal in the CIA, Mike Pompeo. This is very important, because what you see by the cover, the way these things go quote unquote viral in the social media, is because there is a resonance. I think people know that we are in grave danger, and they know that our leadership is grossly both out of touch with reality and corrupted by what they perceive as their own personal small interests. But this is not a fight that we can afford to lose, those of us who insist on peace and a new security architecture. And I just, again, want to express my gratitude for everybody who is here. Helga, the work you're doing internationally is crucial. The military experts, Jacques, our French friends, there's going to be, I should say, another conference November 22nd of a group of legislators from around the world. We have to do everything in our power to get off of this trajectory. And my question about not being like the crowd in the Emperor's New Clothes and going along with the naked emperor who's bearing a nuclear bomb has to be taken very seriously. So that's what I would say, and thank you, everybody.
Okay, very good. Ray.
I just wanted to say that I really appreciate the courage, the guts displayed by Diane and by those who support her. All of the rest of you, including Scott Ritter, who has been a terrific support to Diane, and whom the New York State people can no longer completely avoid or mute. So my hats off to Diane. I wish her good luck on November 22nd. Hopefully she will be senator-elect.
Okay, so now we go to Nick Brana. Yes.
Thank you, Dennis. Thank you, everybody. My name is Nick Brana. I'm the national chair of the People's Party. I'm very pleased, very happy, reassured to see you hosting this get together today. It's urgently needed. I worked for the Democrats, including John Kerry, Terry McAuliffe, and Bernie Sanders before leaving the Democratic Party and founding the People's Party, along with others who worked with me at the Bernie Sanders campaign in 2016. And we agree at the People's Party that this is the moment of greatest existential risk to humanity and the world itself, and have called for the disruption of politicians at their events across the country, as we've seen from Jose and so many others at the Schiller Institute, in an act of real courage. I myself am just returning with a couple of others from a disruption of Tim Kaine's event with Jennifer Wexton here in Virginia. My members of Congress, I'm a lifelong resident in Virginia. She is my member of Congress, and Tim Kaine is my senator. They, of course, affirmed the now unanimous Democratic Party line that is essentially a nuclear war policy with no realistic off-ramp or end to the war in Ukraine, and support for the troops that are now openly being sent into Ukraine, the American troops. I had two questions, one for Scott, and that is, how important do you believe that a Russian victory in Ukraine is to China? What actions do we expect China, do you expect China to take? For example, if the US follows through on General Petraeus's threat on behalf of the US to assemble a coalition of the willing to invade from the West and take a chunk of the country. And I had a second question for you, Ray, and it's good to see you again. Does the US acknowledge the reality of nuclear winter in the Pentagon? In effect, does the United States acknowledge that a nuclear war cannot be won, that it would destroy global agriculture, supply chains, and the world, even in the completely ludicrous scenario that you could wipe out Russia with nukes before they fired a single nuclear weapon or struck you a single time? Thank you.
Okay, I'll do my best to answer that question. First of all, thank you for the question. Russia and China are two sovereign states. They're not allies, they're friends. Friendship is better than allies, we've been told. But the reason why I bring this up is that China has not been a cheerleader for the Russian invasion of Ukraine. In fact, the Russian actions fly in the face of established Chinese principled policy, which is in opposition to things of this nature. But China and Russia met on February 4th, where they entered a 5,000 plus word joint statement that had been negotiated for some time, that spoke of the two of them working together in a collaborative fashion to defeat the rules-based international order, that's code word for the American NATO singularity, and to promote a law-based multipolarity that would be represented in some shape by something they call the Trans-Eurasian Economic Union. I want to emphasize the word economic union. That's the direction China wants to go. China's not looking for military domination. They're looking for a competitive economic environment where they'll be a big player in the game. China will not commit troops or military resources to help Russia solve the issue of Ukraine. It is up to Russia to do this. And Russia is doing this. What China will do is ensure that Russia is able to sustain itself economically throughout this crisis, and they have done so by purchasing Russian energy and encouraging others to do the same. And this is actually more important to Russia than Russia is fully capable of handling not only Ukraine, but the collective West. And while Petraeus may look good on TV saying what he said, there's just no viability to the notion that the United States and a coalition of the willing are going to intercede into Ukraine. It would mean nuclear conflict, because Russia will not differentiate between that intervention and a NATO intervention, and the powers that be know this. China also knows that therefore, but for the grace of God, go them, meaning that the conflict that NATO, the collective West, is waging against Russia and Ukraine right now is the future of China and Taiwan if Russia does not prevail. That the best way forward for China to have a peaceful integration with Taiwan is for Russia to prevail in Ukraine militarily and thereby send a shot across the bow of NATO that your interventions in what are the internal affairs of other nations will not end well for you. China is not seeking a conflict with the West, but China will not shirk away from what it deems to be its historical mandate of a one China inclusive of Taiwan. So China isn't going to sit back and let Russia lose. China is doing everything they can to ensure a Russian victory because Russia and China have a relationship stronger than any alliance, according to them. And that relationship depends on both nations being at the table to ensure that this dream of a trans-Eurasian economic union becomes reality.
Thank you.
Okay, let me just ask if anyone else from the panel has a comment about that. If not, we will go to the next question.
I had a question for Ray about nuclear winter and whether the US and the Pentagon acknowledge the reality.
They would have to be idiots not to acknowledge it. That's not to say that some local or even strategic commander could just sort of dismiss it or prescind from it, as philosophers say. We have remarks by the head of SAC, or they call it STRATCOM now, the Strategic Air Command, okay? And he's talking about these little tactical missiles. You might come to a nuclear, kind of small nuclear thing. So again, it doesn't matter what McGovern thinks. It's what Vladimir Putin thinks as he looks on all this. And he is convinced, partly by Biden having to renege on promises he made on the 30th of December last year. Who's in charge? Is it the head of the White House? Is it these unwashed sophomores that are advising him? Or is it more likely the head of the Strategic Air Command? So when I'm sort of in that kind of position, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, I have to prepare for the worst, the more so since my generals and my admirals are looking over my shoulder. That's why it's so delicate. Thanks for the question.
Okay, very
Thank you.
good. Very good. Now, Karen Wilson. Okay. And, okay, I'll just wait. There's several other questions. I see her on screen, but she's muted.
Can you see me now?
Well, we can hear you now.
Oh, okay. Yeah, the reason I'm here is because I was one of the probably hundreds of thousands who saw the videos of the Schiller people standing up and confronting politicians on their support of war. And I contacted Schiller because my background is an organizer for anti-war. I built actually by myself, I built the first anti-war work group in DSA when it was growing right after the Bernie Sanders campaign. And this is something that is very much needed. So I basically just going to say a couple of things about the anti-war movement in the United States. There is one. A message came up. There is an anti-war movement in the United States. The problem is that it's old. The people who are part of it are old. They're elderly. I worked with Berrigan's widow. We were protesting the war in Yemen in what is that square in Washington, in New York City. I can't remember it. I can't remember the name of it, but we would stand there with our signs explaining what was going on. And I was in DSA building the first working anti-war work group and trying to get them over to these older elements that are there who are waiting for us to come. They're still there. And so that's an untapped resource. But going to the question of what does these politicians think and what does these Newland and Sullivan and all those people think? It doesn't matter what they think. At the end of the day, history in the decisions of nations, it is the will of the people that decides these things. Now is the time for the people to intercede. We have a problem. We have some crazy people. Who knows what they're thinking? It doesn't matter what they're thinking. We just have to intercede. So I'm here to advocate for the building of an anti-war movement. Again, and bringing them into where they already exist. And then the last thing I'll say is that this has to lead to the original, the origin of this problem that we have to now talk about nuclear war again. I grew up my dad was in the military. I lived in West Berlin. That was ground zero for nuclear war. And you don't want to go through that. I lived in anxiety. I was a kid. I should have been thinking about other things. And people do understand. Regular people do understand. They're not ignorant. They are not informed. And people are very logical. The people in Biden's cabinet are insane. And so it's there. The will is there. It's just getting it organized. And so I know how to do that. So I'm going to be working with Anastasia on it. But we have to, at the end of the day, we need to build a party because our interests are not being represented in Congress. There is no sane American person that wants nuclear war. So we have to, this is where all roads have to lead. It's got to be a mass party. It's got to cut across all lines. It's got to cut across all politics. It's got to cut across the identity politics. You can't have it there because we have even bigger issues. We have other issues too. We have economic issues in this country that people are very angry about. And the anti-war movement that needs to be built can tap into those things to finally build the party, the political party that we need. Right now, the independents are the largest part of the political identity. We're at 43%. Democrats are at 24%. Republicans are at 30%. We are right now the majority, and that is the solution to this problem, the long-term solution to this problem. That's all I have to say.
Okay, well, thank you. I see that Jacques Cheminade has his hand up, and we also, I believe, have Kynan, who's one of the people who's been doing the interventions. So I'm going to go to Jacques first, and then we'll go to Kynan.
Okay.
Jacques, you're muted. Yeah.
Well, something about France. 75% of the French voters have either abstained or voted for candidates calling in principle to get out of the integrated command of NATO. So there is a majority against NATO and a majority against the financial oligarchy. But there are two fake oppositions, a fake left and a fake right wing. And the capacity of the government is to divide to rule and to exacerbate this division. So there cannot be a clear-cut opposition. In this situation, the domestic economic consequences of sanctions on Russia are going to be felt strongly and create in broader and broader segments of the population a new wave of anger. So this anger has to get a form, has to get a political expression, which is not blind. It should be in the sense of what Elga said before, economic priority of common development inside a country like France, but inside other countries, and internationally, according to our new Bretton Woods proposal and what Lyndon LaRouche has defined. So this has to be, for the people, a way to see into the future beyond geopolitics and beyond the fixation on winners that try to get all the financial profit of their winning, but instead a sense of common development. And in that way, and that answer to another question, a lot of people are calling for France to play a role together with, if possible, Germany, a role that would break with the impotence that they have manifested to defend the Minsk agreements, and now to go with China, trying to create the conditions for a diplomatic solution and create a community of development at an international level. So we are really fighting for that in many, just before the Gilets jaunes developments here, I said that I forecasted that a period of anger was going to come. Now there is a new period of anger that is coming, but it should take a shape. It should be represented by a new type of leadership. And in that sense, what's happening in France is no different than what's happening in other countries, except that you have this past Gaullist exception. But there is a need for a new type of leadership committed on what I'm trying to say. And Diane Sare represents precisely that. That's why, even if I am not American, I can say that I support what she means as a leadership, as a quality of leadership, for her courage, her dignity, and her capacity to think at the same time in economic, cultural, and international terms. And this brings to people a sense that there is what Ray McGovern calls, that there is something which represents a creative example for the coming, not only after us, but for us all in this coming period. That's extremely, extremely urgent.
Okay, we're going to bring up in a minute, we have Bernice Holland, and we have two questions with several actually were called in. Before we do that, I think we have Kynan Thistlethwaite. Is he there?
Can you hear me? Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So yeah, I just wanted to say a little bit about the intervention process of which both me, Jose, and many others have been involved in. And it really kicked off when Jose had done these interventions on people like Congressman Bowman, Kamala Harris, and Senator Gillibrand. And you know, I'm pretty sure a lot of people have seen the AOC intervention, which went viral recently. And of course, what we were there for was to confront her on the danger of the war crisis, which so many people have talked about now, and the fact that she was elected supposedly as a progressive. She was anti-war, and yet she's been funneling all this money into Ukraine to provoke an escalation, and she's bringing us on the brink of a thermonuclear catastrophe. And it went viral for the reasons that Diane stated, and that people are resonating with it. People don't want to fight this war. People think that, you know, the hyperinflationary blow, which we're facing, is a much bigger deal than blowing all of ourselves up. So it went viral, and as a result of it, people have been speaking out more. We've had a lot more younger contacts who are going out and doing their interventions for the first time. And an example of this is one that happened recently with Mike Pompeo at Yale University. I was involved in it, Jose was, and our friend Ben Smith came and he recorded what we had to say, and he himself spoke up. So it's powerful. People are actually getting inspired by it to do what Ray talked about, which I really liked when you talked about this, Ray, of the Noah principle, of actually building this arc in which everyone has to play a leading role. And also, just another thing to mention, one of our members of the Schiller Institute had proposed this idea of having these candle night vigils where we sing a 4-part canon called Dona Nobis Pacem, which means grant us peace in Latin. And we go out and we sing in these vigils to protest against the war in a non-violent fashion. So people are actually standing up, and they're protesting in the spirit of the creative non-violent action which Martin Luther King, you know, did so successfully in the civil rights movement. So I think that's what I just wanted to say, just what this process is like. And yeah.
Okay, thanks. And also we'll be hearing, I think, from Jose in a little bit as well. Let me just check one thing. Scott, I see your hand is still up. Did you have something you wanted to say?
Yes, just real quick. First of all, Karen Wilson. I wrote a book called Waging Peace, The Art of War for the Anti-War Movement. Anti-war movement's dead. This book is useless. You say you want to bring the anti-war movement back, send me your address. I'll mail you a copy of the book. Use it in good health. I have a question for the French participants in this conference. France has an independent nuclear deterrent force. What needs to be done to get France willing to come up to the table and negotiate away this nuclear deterrence? Because there can't be nuclear disarmament until France is ready to disarm in a nuclear fashion. So that's my question to my French colleagues.
Okay, who would like to take that? Jacques, I see your hand. Okay, go ahead.
Wait.
Oh.
The camera is on me, so
Go ahead. Go
I
ahead.
will try to answer that.
Go ahead.
First of all, I would like to remind to all people around this table that the French president says clearly that the French nuclear weapons will be used only if the very existence of the French soil is endangered. So if we have no threat against our own soil, we will not be part of a NATO nuclear war. The nuclear war, our nuclear bombs are not allied with the nuclear bombs of NATO. That's very clear, and it has been said very clearly by the French president. So now, for negotiation, I think the president is like yours and like a lot of head of state in the European Union. They are not free for what they are doing. They are under the pressure of somebody much more powerful than them, globalists. They are in the hand of globalists. They have been elected because of the money of the oligarchy, world oligarchy, and globalists, neoconservative people. You have yours in the US, we have ours, neoconservative people in France. They also have the lead on the foreign affairs ministry, department in France. And it's the same in Germany, it's the same in the UK, you know. They have the same people, same kind of people having the control of the country and the control of foreign affairs in the country. So I think the French president will never sit alone because he is not in a situation of sovereignty. He is not the leader of a sovereign country. He is just the dog of the tool of US Department of Foreign Affairs, which leads the whole game. So I don't think a French president will sit alone if he is not supported by Germany, for example. Maybe with Germany they can do something together, but not the French president will not give his bomb to NATO, but will not sit for negotiating whatever. I don't think so. Jack, what do you think about that?
Well, I think that it's wrong to put the issue on the basis of nuclear military disarmament. It's a big mistake. The principle should be, what are we going to do with nuclear energy, with the nuclear energy principle for peace and secure a stable, secure, and a community of development system for the future. And then we can have the nuclear disarmament, all for nuclear disarmament, but it should only be if you have a principle of peace that is positive, and it could not be only a negative position against war. You cannot stop war if you have not a solution for peace. And the solution for peace is the only way to create in our people, in the peoples of our countries, the idea that the community of development is something, and working for the future generations is something much more necessary than to win against the other. The principle of Carl Schmitt, which is the geopolitical principle of French and enemy, should be absolutely thrown to the river, and we can go in the direction of the new Silk Road of the Chinese, or at least the principle of the new Silk Road, with connectivity, community of development, and a win-win system. And then the nuclear disarmament should take place in that context.
Yeah, and I'll also say here that there is a couple of questions on that same theme. I'm not going to intervene because we have a certain order and some other people have gotten in, but I just want to reference this to Helga and to Cliff. There are a couple of questions pertaining to that area. I just want to make sure that there's a couple of people that we get to, and I'll just say to everybody, so everybody knows what's evolving, we got a lower people getting into the discussion, which I think is good. And as long as everybody's prepared to stay with that and keep answering questions, I think we can get a lot out of that. Let me just ask, before we go to Bernie Holland, who is up there, I see him. I understand we have one person may have to get going, and that's Kim.com. Is he there? And does he want to say something? He is. Okay, fine. So we'll take that if Mr. Holland will allow. Thank you.
I'm here.
Okay, great. Go ahead.
All right. Can you guys hear me all right?
Yes, it's pretty good.
We can.
Well, thank you, first of all, for having me. Very nice panel that you guys put together. I have a very simple question. I would like to ask the panelists if they can explain the root cause of the US proxy war in Ukraine in 60 seconds. And after their answers, I would like to briefly share my view.
Well, we can't take all of the panelists, but there's a few. Ray's got his hand up, so let him go. Ray?
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, 60 seconds. Thanks, Kim, for the question. It started when our country assured Gorbachev that NATO would not move 1 inch to the east. That in return for the reunification of Germany, mind you, a big quid, okay? And then we had the coup in Ukraine. After NATO said in its pompousness that Ukraine and Georgia would become part of NATO. The coup in Kiev, first thing they said, we're going to join NATO, okay? Then fast forward to just last year, or 2021, when overtures were made for a new European security realm, when on the 30th of December last year, our president promised Putin that no strike weapons, offensive strike weapons, nuclear weapons would be in place in Ukraine. He reneged on that. And Putin decided on the 12th of February in his conversation with Biden, oops, somebody has overruled Biden. They even reserved the right to put what they've put already in Romania and Poland in Ukraine. That was 2 weeks before the invasion. The other very important aspect, which Scott has alluded to, is that China was on board. Now, China doesn't like people violating the sovereignty of other people, but China gave Putin
an exception to this rule and supported his core interests, and ever since has been very reluctant to say anything pejorative about what Putin has done. Do the math, China and Russia against the United States and what's left of NATO, and you have the outcome of what will happen.
Okay, does anybody else wish to answer from the
Let me
panel?
go because I have to run. So I'm just going to give you a 6. Kim, you said 60 seconds. I'm going to give it to you in 6. Ready?
All right.
Hubris, arrogance, ignorance, greed, sustainment of the American singularity. That's it.
All right. So, Kim, did you want to say something in response?
No, I listened to everyone first.
Okay. Well, I think everybody else is not speaking at the moment, and we've got a lot of other people.
I
with
think
questions.
Helga has raised her hand and Stephen Starr as well.
Actually, I don't see it. Stephen Starr, if you're there.
Yes,
Hello?
I'm here. I was going
Helga's
to
also
comment.
there.
I had a
Okay.
separate question, but I just think in regard to Kim's question, I can't do any better than what Scott and Ray have already said.
Okay, very good. Helga?
I think it is a larger issue because I think we are really experiencing an epochal change. This is the epoch of the fight between the sovereign nation state and the oligarchical system, which erupted in the 15th century when the nation state first emerged. In 600 years, this fight has been ongoing, and now we come to the end of that because now the fight is between those who want to maintain the colonial order and keep the majority of nations in colonial dependency, and the rising nations of the global south who want to end that order. And I think that that is the larger issue in which even the Ukraine issue and NATO are just ephemerals.
Okay. And I think that's going to be it for the panel. So Kim, if you have something to say, go ahead, because we have other people and questions. But if you have a
Sure,
response,
thank you.
please go ahead.
Well, thanks for the answers. I think the whole thing started in 2007, 2008 with the global financial crisis that originated in the United States. After that, the reliability of the United States as a partner in global financial affairs was destroyed. And in 2009, Russia hosted the first BRICS summit to establish a better international financial system with China, India, Brazil, and South Africa, and also future BRICS Plus partners. So BRICS is challenging the US reserve currency status. That is what started the new Cold War with Russia and China. The US knows that without reserve currency status, it will be bankrupt. The US national debt is now at 31 trillion. Total US debt is at 92 trillion. And total US unfunded liabilities are at 172 trillion. And all of that without any surplus to ever pay for any of it. Without money printing on the backs of other nations, it is simply game over for the United States. BRICS was on track to launch its new global financial system by 2030. And Ukraine is the tool for conflict with Russia, Taiwan is the tool for conflict with China, and eventually the US and NATO will be at war with Russia and China. The United States simply has no choice. It's either a war with Russia and China to stop BRICS or the total financial and economic collapse of the United States. So Ukraine to me is a sideshow, and the main event is yet to come.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And, let me also say to everybody that's on, I had said before at the beginning, I don't think you were there, Kim, that virtually any group of the people certainly deserve their own seminar and forum. And I would just welcome the notion of a symposium. We're doing it now, but there would be a lot of matters that would certainly stand a greater and in-depth discussion. So I want to thank you for initiating that. And I'm now going to let Mr. Bernie Holland, who's been more than patient, step up and do his question.
Thank you, Dennis. Right, I'm going to keep this brief because I haven't got time to express my appreciation to everyone for what they're doing. This is for Ray. The incredible speech that Vladimir Putin delivered to the session at Valdai. I would like to refer to this speech and put a question to you, Ray. Here's the, it was the question and answer session after this. This speech was an extraordinary speech in which Putin never disparaged any other world leader. He spoke about the importance of economic solidarity with the BRICS, the ASEAN, Shanghai cooperation, the community of Latin American countries, and the importance of a pan-global alliance. However, I want to go to the question and answer session for this Valdai, where Fyodor Lukyanov, who was on the stage with Vladimir Putin, said this, I quote, 2 years ago, you spoke highly about President Erdogan at the Valdai Club meeting, saying that he did not go back on his words, but did what he said he would do. Many things have happened over the past 2 years. Has your opinion of him changed? Vladimir Putin replies, no, he is a competent and strong leader who is guided above all and possibly exclusively by the interests of Turkey, its people and its economy. This largely explains his position on energy issues and, for example, on the construction of Turk Stream. Now, I'll just jump to the bottom of this piece. It says, but there is a desire on both sides to reach agreements, and we usually do it. In this sense, this was because Putin and Erdogan have not seen eye to eye on certain things, but they realize the importance of maintaining a good relationship. So there is a desire on both sides to reach agreements, and we usually do it. In this sense, President Erdogan is a consistent and reliable partner. This is probably his most important trait, that he is a reliable partner. Now, referring back to what Daryl Egan said earlier about the deterioration of relationships, I would like you to offer your comment, Ray, about the importance of forging healthier relationships in order that the USA and the nations of the Anglosphere can be persuaded to enter the BRICS project. Over to you, Ray.
Well, I think the key here is the reliable partner. Now, Putin also mentioned that this fellow Erdogan is a really tough negotiator, and we have our differences, and he's really a tough guy because he always thinks about Turkey first. Can you imagine that? He thinks about Turkey first. Well, he's really thinking about Turkey a lot now, because it looks like the Turks and the Russians will work out a deal where a lot of that gas and oil that used to be transported through Nord Stream are going to come through Turkey now. Turkey's going to get even richer, and those that had sort of depended on Nord Stream are going to get not all poorer, but they're going to get colder this winter. Okay, so he and Erdogan have this very good relationship where they recognize that each one has their own national interests, right? But he's a reliable partner. Now, comparisons are invidious. Here's a real invidious comparison. The US is not a reliable partner. And I will harken back to something that most people don't know. And that is, on the 30th of January last year, the Kremlin made it known that they had to talk to Biden right away. The White House said, why right away? We're going to meet in Geneva. Just 9 days from now, on January 9/10. And they said, look, Mr. Putin wants to talk to Mr. Biden. Now, to his credit, Biden said, okay. Now, what's the readout? Quote, Mr. Biden agreed that the U.S. has no, this is a quote, has no intention of putting offensive strike missiles in Ukraine, period, end quote. Suffice to say, the next time they talked on the 12th of February this year, that promise or that offer had dissipated, fallen into cracks. None of the negotiators would even talk about it. So this is a reliable partner? So again, put yourself in Putin's position. Who's running the show in Washington? Was Biden overruled? It's hard to escape that impression. So who's running things? These wet behind the ears sophomores? Blinken and Sullivan and Nuland? Hell, Nuland's a little more clever than a sophomore, but it looks like they are in charge. So that's what Putin has to deal with. Again, his generals and admirals are looking over his shoulder. He's got to prepare for the worst. That's why the situation cries out for the kind of action that has been mentioned to my great delight by young people who don't have this color hair, but do it anyway. Thanks, Bernie.
Thank you, Ray.
Okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go to Jacques, who has his hand up, but I have a question for Helga and also for Cliff. It's the same question on this BRICS matter. I've held this for a while, just out of the fact that people obviously had their hands up. So Jacques, you go ahead, and then I'll ask the question.
Just very briefly, it's just an event which made us understand better what's happening presently. In 2006, President Chirac, who sometimes have certain ideas despite his weakness, told his advisor Gourdon-Montagne, go to Russia, tell Moscow that we want a security, stability, and economic cooperation agreement in Europe. So Gourdon-Montagne went to Moscow. In Moscow, there was a lot of interest, and they said, go and talk to the Americans. So Gourdon-Montagne went to the United States, and he met Condoleezza Rice. And Condoleezza Rice yelled at him, it's not you little French dwarfs that are going to prevent us to extending ourselves towards the East. And Gourdon-Montagne asked, but why? It's our economic mandate, and that's it. So that's the oligarchical view when it's cornered, that they have to extend its domination throughout the whole world. And that's an in-depth reason, the geopolitical reason, the geopolitical financial reason of the wars.
All right. So the question came from Mario, and it pertains to the Belt and Road Initiative and its relationship to the BRICS Plus process. So the question is, if Belt and Road were to become an official project of the BRICS Plus, what does that mean? What does that do? Second, if there were some sort of counter Belt and Road Initiative launched by NATO, the Anglosphere, and so on, the question is, does that provoke a war, or is there a basis in all of this for peace? So I realized that's what the question is, but I wanted to refer this to Helga. Let me also just say to everybody, because they wouldn't necessarily know this, that Helga was recently, yesterday actually, in discussion in China about both the question of Germany's involvement there, the discussions with Chancellor Scholz, but more importantly, also just the general idea of this whole project. So Helga, I'd like you to go first, and then Cliff, you may have a comment on that.
Well, I think because of the absolute unified mass media who are trying everything to suppress news of that kind, people don't know. But in reality, you have the emergence of a completely new system whereby all the different organizations of the Global South, the BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Eurasian Economic Union, the KICA, that's the Organization for Confidence Building of, I think, Central Asia, and many other organizations of the Global South, African Union, the Dakar Consensus, which is being built as an alternative to the Washington Consensus. All of these organizations are in the active process of organizing a new world economic system, a new currency based not on monetarist values, but on the basket of commodities, therefore having a much larger stability. And they're already doing, they're involved in the process of de-dollarization, doing a lot of trade in the national currencies, rupees, rubles, renminbi, and other currencies. And this is going to emerge. And so that is the powerhouse, because the whole economic development has moved to Asia, and a lot of these countries are in Asia, but not only, because now you have Brazil, Argentina. Brazil is already in the BRICS. Argentina is moving towards that, Indonesia, Nigeria, other countries. So, you know, a new world is emerging. This is why I said before, the real reason for all of this is because the majority of the countries of the world do not want any longer to be under the dictatorship of an oligarchy, which prevents their development. So that's why I think this is an epochal change, because, you know, what the non-aligned movement attempted with the Bandung Conference in 1955, and with all the conferences in Colombo, and, you know, at that time, these countries were destabilized. Indira Gandhi was destabilized. Mrs. Bandaranaike from Sri Lanka was destabilized. Bhutto was actually assassinated, and there are the famous words by Henry Kissinger saying that they wanted to make a bloody example of him because he dared to raise the debt issue. So a lot of momentum got lost, and we know this very well because we were in the middle of that. We were not observers, but we were organizers of this. So this is now re-emerging, and is re-emerging with very powerful momentum, because unlike in the 50s, 60s, when this non-aligned movement was active, now they are allied with China. And China has accomplished something which is actually unique. And people should forget what they read in the media about China, communism, all of this. I know China very well. I have been there the first time in 1971 in the middle of the Cultural Revolution. And I have seen with my own eyes the vector of development. I have step by step, going back once in a while, seen, you know, how 850 million people got elevated out of poverty. China has now 850 million people. That's about, you know, more than two times the entire population of the United States. They have now a middle class, a wealthy or well-to-do middle class of 400 million. That's more people in the middle class than the American population or the European, approximately like that. So, you know, these countries are now united with China on the Belt and Road Initiative, whereby almost 150 countries cooperate. And, you know, it's not that these countries are being coerced into the debt trap. This is all war propaganda, you know, and China is not trying to impose their model on anybody. I mean, if you look at if you study Chinese history of the last 2,500 years since Confucius came into the picture and played a steady role in the state philosophy of China, they are not aggressive.
Hey, I apologize, everyone.
Excuse me?
Am I too long?
No, not that. I don't know who said who, whatever. Please continue.
Okay. No, all I want to say is that, you know, China is right now the second largest economy of the world, and these countries are working with China because China is offering them something which the West did not do. Europe did not develop Africa. We could have done it, but we were too colonial, racist, arrogant to do it. So China is now doing it, working with India, working with China, Russia, and many of the other developing countries. So I think the only way we will get out of this war danger, and that is my deepest conviction since a very long time, is if we manage to get the United States and European nations to understand that it is much in their interest to cooperate. And Xi Jinping has repeatedly offered to the United States to build a new type of relationship among great powers. Scholz, the Chancellor of Germany, just was yesterday in China with a large economic delegation of CEOs of the large firms of Germany. And, you know, I think we should really mobilize for that, because, you know, the only way how we will get out of this is we have to build a new paradigm whereby, you know, geopolitics has to stop. And we have to all start with the idea that we are the one humanity first. And we have to start thinking like world citizens who, you know, I mean, if the danger of nuclear war makes us all world citizens overnight, because when the whole existence of mankind is at stake, we are all entitled to be world citizens, and we should start thinking that way. And if we get in time a lot of people in Europe and in the United States to recognize that all this propaganda against Putin, against Xi Jinping, the so-called democracies against the autocracies, this is all war propaganda and is not backed up by the reality of these countries. And if you want to discuss that more, we should enter a dialogue, because it's just a lack of information why people have these ideas.
Okay, very good. Cliff? If
Am I unmuted?
you're okay.
Okay. Well, a little hard to follow Helga. She said most everything I would say. The present trend, of course, in the world is this bifurcation on the planet between the West versus the rest, between the West and the global South. So we're unfortunately seeing a sharpening of this bifurcation of the international community. And the global South, of course, is lining up or receptive to the leadership of China and Russia. And as Scott pointed out, the February 4th statement of China and Russia, Xi Jinping and Putin's statement is a critical statement that everyone should read to understand their thinking about this changing world, moving from a unipolar US West dominated world to a multipolar, or as the Russians call it, a polycentric order, or as a good friend of mine calls it, the pluralism, a pluralistic order. The United States and London, Wall Street and London, let's go back a bit. What we're facing on the part of the West is the oligarchy that's been mentioned, the transnational oligarchy, which is in the service of finance capitalism. And of course, the two main bases of finance capitalism are London and New York. So while there have been many writers about the problems of imperialism and finance capitalism over the years, starting with Professor Professor Hobson in England, for example, in 1900, and Lenin wrote, and Hilferding, and a range of intellectuals wrote, economists wrote about the problem of finance capitalism linked to imperialism. A most recent author, Michael Hudson, Professor Hudson, it's a bit what Kim.com was referring to, the issue of the Western financial powers that be attempting to maintain the dollar as the international reserve currency, or as Hudson says, the treasury bills as the international reserve, US dollar denominated treasury bills. Hudson has a whole new book, 3rd edition, on that subject. But the bottom line for me is that this bifurcation is happening, as Helga pointed out. Many new platforms are being formed: the Belt and Road, the BRICS, the SCO, the Eurasian Economic Union. So there are these other platforms that are being formed. The United Nations, in a way, has failed for the time being, I think, owing to the pernicious influence of the United States and other Western countries. And the United Nations needs a substantial reform to be able to realize its ideals. But in the meantime, then, as Helga pointed out, there are these other platforms that are emerging in the global South. And it's those platforms and processes that are in confrontation, or the West is in confrontation with, Washington is in confrontation with, or we can say that Wall Street is in confrontation with via their tools in Washington, Congress and the president. So my only view would be to, we all work hard, like Ray says, in each of our own ways, to fight for a pluralistic world, a multipolar world. I write for a Chinese publication called China Focus. So you could Google China Focus and you can see some of the things I've been writing, which are very critical of, unfortunately, are very critical of our country, of our foreign policy. And as the completely incompetent team that Biden has, Biden's a walking ghost. I served in the Senate for 11 years. I used to see Biden and his staff all the time, obviously, and I was on the Foreign Relations Committee. And Biden is just a ghost of what he was back then. And it's two completely different people. So here's a problem for the United States. China has a strong leadership and a vigorous culture, and Russia has a strong leadership and a vigorous culture. And the United States has a weak leadership and a disintegrating culture. And so to turn us around, it's going to take a lot of people with goodwill. Some of the
okay, Cliff seems to be frozen. Let's go to Steve Starr, because you've had your hand up for quite a while.
Yes, thank you. I had a question for Ray or whoever wishes to answer. And it has to do with the idea of nuclear primacy. I wondered if Ray thinks the neocons in the White House that he described running US policy now believe in the idea that the US could have a nuclear first strike against Russia and eliminate the Russian ability to retaliate with any nuclear weapons. This idea was put forth by the Council on Foreign Relations in 2006.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I think Scott put it correctly in his 6-minute response. It's arrogance, it's exceptionalism, it's indispensability. These Ivy League educated folks are the same folks that got us in war in Vietnam, for God's sake. They're privileged. They haven't served in the military. They don't know what's going on in the real world. They think that the US can prevail. Let me just, I think that's the answer to your question, but I want to broaden that out a little bit. Helga mentioned racism. You know, people talk about a new multipolar world. Well, I prefer addressing it as a bipolar world, okay? Bipolar in both senses, in the psychiatric sense as well, okay? Bipolar in the sense that it's the lily white West against the rest of the world, almost all of them what we call blithely people of color. as if people of color are not quite up to the standards of the lily white West. Now, all I need to do is cite the recent statement of Joseph Borrell, high European Union guy, in charge of their foreign policy. And he said, well, we, the lily white West, he says, we in Europe are the garden. Outside the garden, there's the jungle. And we have to protect against the jungle. My God, that's exactly what James Baldwin wrote to Angela Davis, what, in 1970. So count it up. What's that, 52 years? Okay, here's what he said. And it's not long. I'll just read a little portion of it. Let me put it this way, Angela, says James Baldwin. As long as white Americans take refuge in their whiteness, they will allow millions of other people to be slaughtered. So long as their whiteness puts so sinister a distance between their own experience and the experience of others, they will never feel themselves sufficiently worthwhile to become responsible for themselves. As we once put it in our Black church, they will perish in their sins, or that is, in their delusions. Two more sentences. We know that a person is not a thing. We know that air and water, now this is 1970, okay? We know that air and water belong to all humankind and not merely to the wealthy. We know that a baby does not come into the world merely to be the instrument of someone else's profit. Now, I think we have to kind of be realistic here and brutally honest. Russia has been blackened to the point where they are all now people of color, right? So you have the lily white West against all the rest of the world. Like Russia is isolated? Give me a break. We have to contend with that. And we have to educate enough of our citizens to realize that they're not privileged, they're not exceptional, they're not indispensable. They're really a great risk, as Kim.com pointed out, of going bankrupt. Not only that, but nuclear war. Thanks very much for the opportunity to say those things.
Thank you.
Okay, now we have General Delaware up, and then I'm just going to say this so everybody knows, because we're almost at 2 o'clock. There are a lot more questions, and we're clearly going to have to take this up in some way again. So I'm going to go to the general, and then I'm going to do something to sort of try to, bring this to a close. And I'll say something about what we'll do with the questions. So General, go right ahead. I think you're muted. You have to unmute.
I would like to address 2 points very quickly. First of all, I support 200% all what Helga says in his speech about the new world order. Second point, yesterday I was searching data to measure the difference of growing economy between the BRICS and NATO and US and EU. And I realized that in the last 20 years, the GDP of the BRICS cumulated, the 5 countries GDP, the cumul of the 5 countries GDP was multiplied by 10 in 20 years, okay? The GDP of the Western world, I say EU and the US, was multiplied by a little bit more than 2. So that says everything. In clear, in 2002, the GDP of China was 10 times less than the GDP of the US. Now is very close. 18,000, just China. But the GDP of the BRICS was about 5-6 times less than the GDP of the US. Now, the GDP of the BRICS is more than the GDP of the US, and much more than the GDP of EU, 50% more than the GDP of EU now. And I speak in nominal dollar, so in dollar. But if you go to power parity GDP, the GDP of the BRICS is more, the 5 states of the BRICS is more than the GDP of the US plus the GDP of EU. So you cumulate GDP of EU and GDP of US, and you have the GDP of the BRICS in parity, power parity, purchase parity is more. So just these data and the tempo of growing of the Eurasiatic organization of Shanghai or BRICS, just the tempo of growing economy is so huge that it's like in a highway. We, Western world, are driving at 50, they are driving at 120, something like that. So it's finished. It's finished. The world is now a new world. Whatever we can do in Ukraine or elsewhere, the world has changed now.
Okay, well, thank you very much. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to bring up Jose Vega, who has had a question that he wanted to pose, and he will also discuss a bit about the interventions and so on. And I'm going to ask whether people answer his question or respond who are there in the panel, so that we sort of have closing remarks. We're at 1:59 and we've been on for almost 3 hours, and we will be on for a little bit more than that. And I just say for people that wrote in questions, we will direct the questions to people if you had individual people, and if you did not and you wish to do that, then just resubmit it, and we will make sure that these questions are conveyed. Also, we will discuss among the panelists when we may be able to reconvene, given of both the urgency of the situation and also now the way in which this discussion process has evolved. So I think what we should do at this point is let's go to Jose, and then Jose, you can pose your question, and then we will go to our remaining panelists.
Okay, hi, can you hear me okay? And can you see me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, yes, hi. So this is Jose Vega here from New York. Ray, I actually wanted to comment on a bit of your NOAA principle, that we shouldn't give awards anymore for predicting rain, but for building arcs. And I think this is something similar to what Lyndon LaRouche had written in a book that he wrote called In Defense of Common Sense, because there's a difference between momentary survival and durable survival. And I think back in history to the period of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then to the INF Treaty, and then today. We do keep saving ourselves somehow out of nuclear war, nuclear tension, but we always keep coming back to it. And one question I want to pose to you, Ray, is, how do we make sure that we don't come back to this question of nuclear tension for generations, for forever, that we never have to deal with this long after we're all gone? And then the second thing I want to pose to you, Ray, and also to everybody who can comment on this as well, is this idea of the nonviolent principle. Because Dr. King wrote about nonviolence in his letter from a Birmingham jail, but specifically he talks about this idea of Socratic tension. And I just want to quote from the letter where he says, nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and foster such a tension that a community which has constantly refused to negotiate excuse me, hi, sorry, that a community which has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. It seeks so to dramatize the issue that it can no longer be ignored. And then he says, just as Socrates felt that it was necessary to create a tension in the mind so that individuals could rise from the bondage of myths and half-truths to the unfettered realm of creative analysis and objective appraisal, so must we see the need for nonviolent gadflies to create the kind of tension in society that will help men rise from the dark depths of prejudice and racism to the majestic heights of understanding and brotherhood. And Ray, I think you know something about nonviolence, because I have a picture of you here, which I will bring up right now. Can folks see that okay?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. And also, oh, Ray, I guess if you could also kind of give me the context a little bit too of what's happening here. So I know that was quite a lot, and I also would like to hear Helga's response to that too. But first, I'd like to hear from Ray on that.
Ray, you're muted.
Jose, thanks for that bit of memory. I was in the Senate when the torturer-in-chief at the first Black site in Thailand, Gina Haspel, known in CIA circles at the time as Bloody Gina, who all those senators knew was supervising on the site waterboarding and worse, were confirming her to become the new director of the CIA. They all knew it, the Democrats as well as the Republicans, and they were all going to acquiesce in her being appointed. I was there. I got up and I went to the front of the balcony. Nobody expected me to do that. And I addressed the Democrat senators and said, you know, and you're unwilling to say that this is a torturer, okay? We know now from court testimony that she was there. Well, I had about 6 or 7 seconds to say what I wanted to, and it was recorded. And then you saw what happened to me. So the issue is that, well, I had a very nasty next 24 hours, and it's really not a nice place there underneath the Capitol in their prison, but it's worth it. And there was, my memory of not only Martin Luther King Jr., but the person that I try to follow, Jesus Christ of Nazareth, who was also, pretty much tortured, okay? So I'm thinking this thing through and I'm saying, well, maybe I did the right thing. And then I looked at my arm here and I said, oh, McGovern, you got the right skin color. You're gonna be out of here in a day. And I was. Now, what's the point of all this? The point of all this is you've got to make sure that something happens so you get some attention and play. Did I get any play for that? Not much, but a little bit. And talking about my idol, Dr. King, and his letter from the Birmingham City Jail, I would like to quote one portion, which is in addition to what Jose just mentioned. It's very important, but it hasn't been very quoted much. I used to use it in every course I took. Now, here it is. Dr. King compares injustice and deceit to a boil. Now, some of you have had boils, maybe when you were in adolescence. I've had them Medea Benjamin used to say at this point, Ray, too much talking, too much explaining, too much data, okay? Okay, like a boil, says Martin Luther King, like a boil that can never be cured unless it is opened up with all its ugliness to the natural medicines of air and light. So true, injustice and deceit cannot be cured with all the tension that its exposure creates to the natural medicines of light and human conscience before it can be cured. That's our task, folks. It's pretty easy to do. The problem is getting the exposure. Some of us don't get exposure a lot.
I was also beaten up when I tried to challenge General Petraeus and Hillary Clinton. But, you know, it's worth it because, as says Dr. King and Daniel Berrigan, a disciple of Dr. King, both said, you know, the good is worth doing because it's good. If it pains you a little, that's all right, because the results are not immediate. You got to just keep doing it. Anyway, I'd add one little thing here, and that is that you have to keep your sense of humor when you're doing this, okay? Because it's a long, tough slog. What am I saying? I said when Daniel Berrigan was in that post office with his brother Phil and the 6 or 7 others, in came, and Daniel explains it this way, in came the paradigm of an FBI inspector. He threw open the door and he looked around. He saw my brother Phil in his clerics, and he said, "You again? I'm gonna leave my religion." And Daniel writes, no higher compliment could come to my brother Phil. Now, what's that all about? That is, you have to keep your sense of humor because it's a tough slog. Once you keep your sense of humor and believe that you're not going to see immediate results, well, then you're in the right perspective. Then you're pursuing justice as Dr. King wanted us all to pursue it.
Helga? I think you're muted.
I think that the question of nonviolence is extremely important. And, you know, after George Floyd was assassinated, we initiated this committee of coincidence of opposites, which was supposed to be based on the principle of nonviolence. And this is a long discussion I don't want to go into, but the nonviolent method of Dr. King was much inspired by Mahatma Gandhi. And I think that that is also a memory worth having because it was his movement which defeated the British Empire. And, you know, given the fact that we are now confronted with nuclear war, and nuclear war is obviously the utmost form of violence you can imagine. I cannot think of a more brutal violence than that. It's useful to remind ourselves of a question which was asked to Jawaharlal Nehru. You know, is nonviolence actually useful in terms of nuclear weapons? And Nehru said, if there is anything adequate to nuclear weapons, it is nonviolence. So I think we should keep that in mind in terms of the efforts we are going to have, because, you know, the empire rules by causing people to be violent and divides and conquers them and all of this. But I think the idea of nonviolence in the Mahatma Gandhi sense, in the Nehru sense, and in the sense of Dr. King is what we should keep in mind.
Thank you, Helga. And while what we'll do is we're going to ask people for final statements as our panelists. I think we'll begin with Steve Starr, if he, yes, there you.
Yes, thank you. Well, there was a question about how do we prevent nuclear war in the future? And I would suggest that the only way to do this, and it could be rapidly accomplished, not with a technical thing, but by forcing the leaders of all nations, including those of the nuclear weapon states, to publicly acknowledge and discuss the existential dangers posed by the long-term environmental consequences of nuclear war. Once we get that as a starting point, that people, and then the people of the world will listen to that. I mean, they'll be forced to if the leaders publicly discuss this. Then we can move from there to start eliminating these arsenals that we have that can wipe, you know, it'll kill most people and large and land animals on the planet. We have a nuclear war. We can't forget how to make a nuclear weapon, but if we can get to the point where we eliminate these enormous arsenals, then at some point in the future, if somebody decides to try to make a few of them, well, there may be nuclear detonations, but they won't wipe out the human race. Thank you.
Thank you very much. General Delaware, any final thoughts?
Oh, I think he may have had to get going.
He had to get going? Okay, fine. Then let me ask Cliff. Is he there? Are
He
you?
just
Am I
unmute.
unmuted? Okay.
Yes, now you are.
What I would say is kind of the theme I had in my earlier talk, that we need to really hold our officials and whatever toward a policy of diplomacy for peace. What's happened in our country is that our foreign policy is the militarization of foreign policy. You know, the Pentagon is really running things. It's not the State Department. You know, has very little influence. We have this militarization of American foreign policy. So I think, as far as I'm concerned, from my perspective, we need to insist on diplomacy for peace and change the focus. Everything is militarized, or as Helga mentioned, it's geopoliticized. So I just would say let's go for a peace policy, a diplomacy of peace, Westphalian peace, however you want to phrase it.
All right, very good. Is the Colonel still with us? Is he not? I can't quite tell. And if not, Jacques?
Well, today, I think more than ever, than we in the West are potentially many, and our enemies, the enemies of humanity, are few. So how can we make efficient for us to organize our people to defend the common good and the future generations? And what Helga stressed, which is nonviolence, organized nonviolence, is what breaks through the barriers of confidence or not confidence, and which creates a sense and a principle of unity in a multipolar world. And this principle of unity is what makes people be confident in that what they have thought as the best of our lives, and most of the time have been deprived of it, is possible. And if we act as we started to do here, and we started to do in other conferences of Schiller Institute, and all what we try to do in our countries, I think this is not only possible, but it's our future.
Thank you. Ray?
I'd like to quote very briefly two of my favorite people, Annie Dillard, the theologian, who said, "There are enough of us. We're around, okay? The thought that there aren't enough of us, well, that's wrong. We are here, we're enough, and there never has been any other than us." And the second one would be Martin Luther King himself, who warned, and I like the sense of urgency that has been inculcated into this conversation. He warned that there is such a thing as too late. Okay? He had used some examples, but let me leave you with that. There is such a thing as too late, and I think we still have some time left, but not much. And as Steve has said, and others, we need to do it right now, whatever it is, because there are enough of us. My favorite person, Cesar Chavez, used to say, we're going to do this. And they would say, no, there aren't enough of us. And he said, there are enough of us, but nothing's going to happen without action. So that's my appeal for action. Let's build those planks for that arc. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Helga? You're muted.
Okay, a couple of points. The urgency, absolutely, because I do not think that the Pentagon believes in the nuclear winter. One example of that is that they have every year a maneuver called Global Lightning, which has a protracted war using tactical nuclear weapon, then conventional weapon, and it pretends as if this war could go on for weeks, which I think is a complete illusion. This is why the action I would ask everybody to take is to take the video, which was shown at the beginning of this press availability, which shows in brutal clarity what a nuclear war would be. And let's make that viral. Let's take that video all over the planet and make sure that everybody understands that that is what we are talking about. Then second action related to that, we have on the 22nd of this month, that's in a good 2 weeks from now, a very important conference, which will be legislators around the world, but also others, people who are, demonstrating in Germany and elsewhere. And the idea is to create a worldwide movement of world citizens to basically, make sure this is not happening and that the new paradigm is being implemented. Help to build a world movement of world citizens. And since I'm coming from the oldest city of Germany, Trier, I take the privilege to say, world citizens of all countries unite, which is a certain variation of a theme some of you may know. Lastly, I want to say that, I think we are going to go into turbulent times because apart from Ukraine, the largest collateral damage of this whole strategic situation is Germany. And you will see dramatic changes in Germany to come, which people did not expect. But, when you pull the plug and you pull the carpet from underneath an entire nation, you will see reactions people thought would be completely impossible. So I want to end by basically saying, just listen to Ray McGovern and let's go into action.
Steve Starr, Jacques Cheminade, General Delaware, Cliff Kirikoff, Ray McGovern, Helga Sepp-LaBrouche. We want to thank you all for your participation today, as well as Diane Sare, Scott Ritter, Colonel Corvez, and of course, everybody that asked questions and stayed here for the entire discussion. This discussion will be made available probably by no later than this evening in its entirety. And then we're going to begin, as Helga indicated, taking sections of it and circulating it as rapidly and widely as possible. We also want to thank the interventionists, particularly Kynan and Jose, who got on and helped a lot. Colonel Black wanted to actually sort of do a whole promotion of them, but because of time, we did not do that. And we would like to thank everybody that's watching now and has committed themselves, we hope, as a result of this, to taking action. As was said, the time is now, the place is here, and the person is you. So on behalf of Executive Intelligence Review, we'll say good afternoon.